As the Titanic slipped beneath the waves, a man clung to life, and somehow, against all odds, he survived. He thought the drama was over, but what awaited him on land was way colder than the Atlantic Ocean on that dreadful night. When he returned to his home country, Japan, people met him with shame. Newspapers denounced him. Strangers whispered behind his back. His only crime, according to them, was that he didn't go down with the ship and with the other passengers. This is a real story of Masabumi Hosono, the only Japanese person on the Titanic who wrote a letter that sheds new light on the details of the well-known tragedy. Mr. Hosono was in his early 40s when he set out on his journey aboard the Titanic. He was a civil servant, working abroad for 2 years and studying the railway system. He really missed his beloved wife and children back home, so he couldn't wait for his assignment to be over. Finally, in 1912, his long return journey to Japan began. He got to travel in style with the prestigious RMS Titanic on her maiden voyage. He made it to London, where he stayed for a short time and bought a new suit, and then to Southampton. There, he took his place in Titanic's second class. As he mentioned in his writings, he was impressed with the Titanic's grand views, enticing aromas, and lively music. At this point, he was counting every sunrise as it meant he was getting closer and closer to home. On April 14th, the weather was fine, and Hosono woke up at 7 a.m. and had a regular day at the ship. Around 10 p.m., he almost fell asleep while reading, when suddenly he felt that the ship had hit something. Then the ship stopped completely. Hosono didn't take it seriously and just went to sleep. Just after midnight, a steward knocked on his door. He gave the passenger a life buoy and told him to go up to the lifeboat stations. Mr. Hosono quickly got dressed and rushed to the deck, where he saw passengers running around in all directions. No one could tell him what had happened. The crew had already started launching the lifeboats at that point, but he couldn't make it through. Somebody from the crew took him for a third-class passenger and told him to return to the lower part of the ship. When he finally made it to the deck, he saw women and kids getting in the lifeboats. Unlike what they show in the Titanic movie, it wasn't that dramatic, and passengers were remarkably calm. No one was shouting. Many of the men were trying to get into the lifeboats, but the sailors wouldn't let them. The crew was sending distress flares that were shining bright blue in the night sky. Mr. Hosono addressed the situation and prepared himself to end his life that day. Without panic, not to bring shame upon the Japanese people. The Titanic was tilting at a 45-degree angle when one of the officers shouted that there was room for 2 more people. A man immediately jumped in. Hosono knew if he didn't do the same, he would never see his beloved family again. So he jumped inside the lifeboat, and because it was dark and so many things were going on, the conductor didn't notice that 2 men joined them. As they were rowing away from the ship, they saw many passengers still on the deck. They were screaming for help. By that time, the Titanic was tilting by about 60 degrees. After a while, they heard 3 or 4 loud bangs, and the ship disappeared underwater completely with a strange noise. He didn't mention that it broke in half, as they show in the movie. Hosono and 1 Armenian passenger were the only men in the lifeboat. The women were crying about their husbands, and husbands who went down with the Titanic. At this point, our hero realized that people would blame him for sneaking out, and it made him really sad. They were drifting, and the waves were getting higher and higher. The human voices coming from the water and begging for help disappeared. The lucky ones in the lifeboats were now afraid they wouldn't make it out alive either, as they would get hungry and cold really soon. Only around 3:30 a.m., they saw a ship in the distance. Half an hour later, the ship called Carpathia reached them. The boat that Hosono was on was the last to be rescued. Carpathia saved over 700 people from the Titanic, so it was full to the brim. When Carpathia started sailing away, Hosono saw many icebergs and was afraid there would be another collision. They got food and coffee, and when he felt that he was finally safe, he started worrying about the things he had to leave behind on the Titanic. His foreign coins, watches, new Western clothes, and especially his work notes and diary. but he still had half a sheaf of stationery with Titanic's letterhead in his coat pockets, on which he had started writing a letter to his wife in English. Now he used that piece of paper to describe everything that happened to him, this time in Japanese. This diary became the only such document known to exist on Titanic's stationery. There was a roll call for the survivors and collection of personal details on the ship, and everyone received name tags. When they arrived in New York, Hosono went to the offices of a Japanese company to ask his friends to help him get home as soon as possible. Then he traveled to San Francisco and departed for Japan by boat from there. At that point, his story didn't attract a lot of attention. One American newspaper just called him the lucky Japanese boy, and that was it. When he finally made it back to Tokyo, several magazines and newspapers interviewed our hero, and one of them published a photo of him and his family. And that's when the real drama began. The Japanese press described him as a coward. Strangers sent him letters that were less than friendly. He even lost his job, although he would later get it back thanks to his valuable qualifications. The media would urge him to take his own life in the spirit of a samurai. And some even say the textbooks mentioned him as an example of how to be dishonorable. All this because people thought he had selfishly pushed aside women and kids to get into the lifeboat. They said he had embarrassed Japan, although the women and kids' first idea was not part of the samurai code. It came to Japan from the West and became one of their values only in the middle of the 19th century. Back in the United States, a writer who described the disaster in detail called Mr. Hosono a stowaway aboard Lifeboat 10. The crew member who was in charge of that boat told the US authorities that Hosono and the second man had disguised themselves as women to sneak aboard that boat. Luckily, this false accusation never reached Japan. Hosono had to live with the stigma for surviving for the rest of his life. He tried to avoid the public and didn't let his family members ever mention the Titanic in his house. He passed away at the age of 68 in 1939, and even then, he was sure that he was a disgrace to his own family and his entire country. People would shame his relatives for decades, even after his passing away. So his handwritten diary of what happened to him on that horrible April night was sitting in his drawer, well hidden, until 1997. That year, his family finally decided to publish it. Once it came out, an American researcher and Titanic scholar wrote that the diary actually contradicted other stories from that night. Apparently, someone mistook Hosono for another man who was on a different lifeboat. They said he was acting dishonorably. Hosono was rowing as hard as he could to save his fellow passengers, and wasn't just sitting there as a stowaway or pretending to be a woman. That discovery finally restored his honor. The diary Mr. Hosono kept on Titanic stationery is still one of the most detailed accounts of what happened to the passengers that escaped from the drowning ship, against all odds.
Bet you never heard this story about the Titanic. So, this massive luxury ocean liner was heading out of Southampton on its first voyage to New York with over 2,000 passengers and crew on board. I'll spare you the details for now. You know how it all went down. Since there were a lot of things that went wrong during its short lifespan, some couldn't help but wonder, was it really bad luck? Or was there some mysterious force behind the ruckus? Well, for starters, right as it was leaving the harbor, the Titanic nearly crashed into another ship, called the SS New York. How did that happen? Well, 6 tugboats had to pull the massive Titanic into the river to begin its journey. Captain Smith was in charge, but let's be honest, he probably needed a few more cups of coffee before making any big decisions. So, as the Titanic was speeding along, minding her own business, she passed the New York and the Oceanic ships. The Titanic decided to make a left turn, but the suction was just too much for the poor New York. She started to drift off towards the Titanic. The Oceanic was leaning so much, her gangplank smacked into the water like a belly flop in the pool. Thankfully, the captain of one of the tugboats was there to save the day. He used his trusty megaphone to call the Vulcan to the port side of the Titanic to pick up some crew members. He then noticed the New York in trouble and acted quickly, throwing a line to slow her down. The Titanic's captain was probably scratching his head, wondering how to handle these big ships like the Titanic. That's because he'd only recently experienced sailing on larger ships. Close one, right? Well, it was just part of the story. As it turns out, the huge list of misfortunes might have started even earlier. Another theory suggests that during the ship's construction days in Northern Ireland, a fire broke out in the coal bunkers. Talk about a rocky start. If this information is correct, then the ship's hull may have been affected by the incident before it even set sail. Fans of this theory argue that a fire popped up inside one of the Titanic's large coal bunkers and really damaged an important segment of the ship's hull. Some claim there's even photographic evidence to back this up. A bunch of photos documenting how the ship was made and pampered for its maiden voyage were found, and they showed a significant black streak on the outside of the Titanic's hull. Weirdly enough, the streak was really close to where the iceberg hit during that cold April. Now I know what you're thinking. This theory might sound far-fetched, but most of these people have been gathering information about the Titanic for decades, and they're convinced that this is the real deal. They even believe that the fire started way earlier than the day the Titanic set out on its maiden voyage, particularly about 3 weeks prior. Why was this overlooked? Well, because of fear of bad press, mostly. Also, because of all the fuss created around the unsinkable ship, it was important that they stuck to the initial calendar. Of course, not everyone is convinced by this new theory. Some people think it's just another wacky idea to add to the long list of Titanic sensational theories. What if I told you there were even rumors about part of an ancient Egyptian coffin being on board? Could that have had something to do with the disastrous ending of the Titanic? Some truly believe it did. Let me tell you the story about the unlucky mummy. It's a tale that'll give you goosebumps. Back in the 19th century, this ancient Egyptian artifact, a mummy case lid to be exact, was brought over to Europe. And as soon as it arrived, strange things started happening. Now, some of the stories may be a bit exaggerated, but according to journalists, some of them were actually true. The rumors sparked the interest of a British writer who later spent months investigating the mummy case and its alleged related stories. He was planning to write an article debunking the myths, but he found out they were all too real. Unfortunately, he never got to finish his work because he passed away suddenly. Others believed that the mummy case was guarded by Egyptian elementals. They warned others not to mess with the artifact. The mummy case's history is just as spooky. It was found in Egypt and sold to a certain someone conveniently named Mr. W at a party organized by a well-known English lady. When the mummy case arrived in England, it was given to Mr. W's sister, who immediately suffered from financial losses and other troubles. A photographer who took a picture of the case claimed that he captured a living woman's face on the film. The mummy case eventually ended up in the British Museum, and it's still there today. However, rumors say that it was aboard the Titanic and was responsible for its sinking. But don't believe everything you hear. Some sources claim the mummy case never left the British Museum, and the rumor was started by a journalist named William Stead. He was actually a passenger on the Titanic, and he supposedly told his fellow passengers about the ill-fated mummy before the ship went down. Is that what happens when you tempt fate? Seriously doubt it, but it does make you wonder, doesn't it? It gets even weirder, trust me. About 50 passengers got cold feet before the ship took off, and they refused to board the Titanic at the last minute, even if it meant that they'd lose the cost of the ticket. They just had an extremely bad feeling about the whole deal, and even an Irish astrologer warned against making the voyage on the Titanic. I doubt he saw a big ol' iceberg hidden somewhere in the stars, but it does add up to the mystique surrounding the Titanic. And do you know what's even worse? The fact that the ship's binoculars, which could have helped prevent the iceberg collision, were locked up. Apparently, those binoculars could have been used by lookouts on that fateful night. But guess what? The key was held by David Blair, an officer who was sadly bumped from the crew before the ship's departure. Poor guy. He probably didn't even know what he was holding on to. Now, some historians think that if those binoculars were in use, the iceberg might have been spotted earlier. But hey, let's not point fingers here. Others argue that it wouldn't have made a difference. Who knows? Maybe the lookout was too busy looking at the stars to notice a giant iceberg in front of them. But seriously, what were they thinking? Locking up the binoculars on a ship that big is like forgetting to pack sunscreen for a trip to the beach. Also, the ship might have been going a bit too fast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why was the captain in such a hurry? Well, apparently, good old Captain Smith was trying to beat his ship's older sibling, the Olympic, in a race to see which ship could cross the Atlantic faster. I guess he had a bit of a sibling rivalry going on or something. But here's the thing. Even though there were warnings about icebergs in the area, the Titanic just kept on chugging along at full speed ahead. I mean, come on, guys, it's not rocket science. If you know there are icebergs around, maybe slow down a little bit, right? And then, close to midnight on April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit that iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. It also famously had a mere 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible dinghies on board. No wonder it ended up being one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. After the whole event, people started believing in life beyond the veil and contacted mediums, hoping for signs from the ones they had lost at sea. Can't say I blame them, though there's no verified story of someone managing to contact a Titanic passenger from the beyond, though.
In 1998, a diver picked up a strange sonar blip next to the wreck of the Titanic. This blip bugged scientists for over 20 years. The sonar system was clearly showing some huge object was hiding next to the most famous shipwreck in history. The scientists couldn't decide if it was coming from another shipwreck, some sort of a geological feature, or something else they didn't even expect to find there. The mystery was finally solved only in 2022. Paul Henry Nargeolet, the diver who first discovered the blip, teamed up with other researchers and went on a new expedition. They found a whole deep-sea reef made up of various volcanic formations and packed with marine life 9,514 feet under the surface. It turned out the reef was the source of the mysterious blip the sonar had detected. They found sponges, corals, fish, lobsters, and other creatures on top of the basalt ridge. The team made a lot of pictures, videos, and took water samples to study later. They're using computer models to figure out how all the animals and plants found there survive in the deep sea. This can help scientists solve the old mystery of how sponges and corals can spread out across the ocean. These creatures need something solid to hold on to as they grow and multiply. But they also survive in muddy places where it's hard to find these solid surfaces. And it's important for scientists to understand what helps them do it. All of this research is part of a bigger project to see how fragile underwater worlds might change or survive in the future. There's another mystery near the Titanic that Nargeolet wants to explore in the future. He noticed another blip between the Titanic and a newly discovered reef a long time ago. Nargeolet thinks this new mystery object might be even bigger than the reef. The Titanic is lying on the ocean floor in 2 big pieces pointing in different directions. After it had sunk, the boilers, which show where it went down, were found about 600 feet east of the back end of the ship. The bow of the Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Some people who survived the famous shipwreck mentioned that they had seen the ship break in half as it was sinking. At first, no one believed them. But now we know that the Titanic really did split apart between its second and third funnels as it was going down into the water. It took the most famous ship in history
2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others. Water started flooding through anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went under the water and the stern went up at a steep angle of almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing around 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. During the descent, the big funnels were torn off, dragging along cables and other parts of the ship's deck. The ship's front mast also broke and fell, smashing onto the bridge area. The wheelhouse where the captain steered the ship was probably destroyed when the mast came crashing down. The bow was cruising down at about 23 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost half an hour before the stern. The hit was so hard that it bent and broke parts of the ship even more. The decks at the back of the bow collapsed on top of each other. The area around the bridge where the ship was controlled looks especially damaged, almost like a giant fist had squashed it. The roof and sides of the officers' quarters and the gym were pushed in, and railings were bent outwards. Some experts think that when the bow suddenly stopped sinking, a powerful blast of water caused by the sudden halt smashed down onto the wreck. It caused even more damage, but you can't see the damage from when the Titanic hit the iceberg anymore because it's buried under the mud. If you want to go check it out yourself, you must know that the waters around the Titanic are still really dangerous. First off, the icebergs are still wild in the area. In 2019, a total of 1,515 icebergs floated far enough south to get into the paths where ships travel across the Atlantic Ocean between March and August. Second, sunlight can only reach about 3,300 feet below the surface, and beyond that, it's completely dark. The area where the Titanic lies is called the Midnight Zone because there's no light at all. When scientists go down to explore the Titanic, they spend over 2 hours descending through pitch-black water before the ocean floor suddenly appears under the lights of their submersible. Seeing anything down there is tough because the submersible's lights only light up a few feet ahead, so it's easy to get lost. To help find their way, explorers use detailed maps of the Titanic wreck site, built over many years, and special tools like accelerometers and gyroscopes to track the ship's position and orientation. Even with all this technology, it's still really hard to find your way down there. Plus, the deeper you go in the ocean, the more pressure there is from the water all around. At the bottom of the ocean where the Titanic rests, the pressure is about 390 times higher than what we feel at the surface. Because of this, subs need to have really thick walls to survive these extreme conditions and keep the people inside safe. The currents down there aren't as powerful as on the surface, but sometimes so-called benthic storms can create powerful underwater currents that can sweep things away from the ocean floor. The Titanic is affected by them. The currents near it mostly flow from east to west and from northwest to southwest, but they can change direction a lot, especially around the bow section of the wreck. Many experts think that over time, these currents will move enough sand and mud to cover the Titanic wreck with layers of sediment. After more than 100 years underwater, the Titanic slowly started to break down. Tiny microbes have been eating away the metal over the years. This created rusty icicle-like formations called rusticles. These rusticles are making the ship fall apart even faster, especially on the back part. Scientists believe this wreck is breaking down 40 years faster than the front. The wreck is slowly collapsing bit by bit every year. But as long as no one touches or goes inside it, it should stay mostly intact for now. And finally, scientists have found evidence that huge landslides happened around the Titanic wreck long ago. These landslides sent tons of sediment sliding down from the nearby continental slope. They think the last big landslide like this happened tens of thousands of years ago and left layers of sediment up to 328 feet thick. But don't worry, these events are super rare.
It's April 10th, 1912, a sunny spring day. You're one of the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic, just as the ship is about to depart from Southampton. Imagine everyone's excitement, fresh spring air, the sounds of the sea. You're strolling along the highest deck of the Titanic when you notice several lifeboats. As you start counting the boats, you recall the ship's capacity. It's just over 3,000 people. Wait, but are there enough lifeboats for everyone aboard? Let's look into the numbers. The Titanic could carry a needed total of 64 lifeboats, a number which could have easily helped to save all the passengers on board. Chief designer Alexander Carlisle planned to equip the ship with 48 lifeboats, but the Titanic ended up with a mere 20. The fact that this number of lifeboats wasn't enough for all the passengers was not illegal at the time. This was because the number of lifeboats required was calculated based on the tonnage of a ship, not her passenger capacity. Speaking of the Titanic, this number of boats was chosen for aesthetic reasons, to make the decks look less crowded to the ship's elite and high-class passengers. After the final decision on the lifeboats was taken, Carlisle quit his job. Passengers' strolls on the Titanic's decks were pleasing to the eye, but were they worth it in the end? In 2012, a century after the wreck, new documents related to the scandalous lack of lifeboats were uncovered. It appears that a safety inspector named Maurice Clark proposed the addition of at least 10 more lifeboats, 5 hours before the ship was supposed to set sail. But since the ship's owners clearly wanted to leave on time, his plea was overlooked. He was also warned that unless he kept this secret, he would be fired. In retrospect, had the owners followed his advice, an estimated 700 more people might have survived that night. The 20 lifeboats you counted, those that actually made it on board, could have carried only a third of the passengers, even at their full capacity. But tragically, some of them were launched with as few as 12 people when they could have easily saved up to 65 people each. To add to the disaster, the Titanic's crew members were not properly trained on using the lifeboat launching equipment. That's why the boats were launched slowly, improperly, and sometimes without the right supervision. Out of the 20 lifeboats, only 18 were set afloat correctly. Also, passengers were not informed about safety measures. A lifeboat drill should have taken place on the 14th of April, but the captain eventually canceled the event. One of the many myths surrounding the Titanic and its catastrophic ending is also related to the lack of the necessary number of lifeboats. There was no maritime law at the time that said women and children should get into lifeboats first. But it was a universally accepted custom in such types of situations as a shipwreck. Shortly after the Titanic had sunk in the icy Atlantic waters, rumors started to spread. It was said that some desperate men had resorted to dressing up as women in those final moments before midnight on April 14, 1912. They wanted to get a spot on the lifeboats and have a chance to save their lives. At the same time, there's little to no evidence that any of the male passengers of the Titanic had actually done this. In any case, what happened to those 20 lifeboats that were on board the Titanic after the ship hit the iceberg? What we do know is that all these boats were launched between 12:40 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., with a total of 718 people on board. By the time they were rescued by the RMS Carpathia at about 4 a.m. the same day, only 705 people had remained alive. It took the crew of the RMS Carpathia more than 4 hours and 30 minutes to pick up all the passengers and 13 of the lifeboats. This was as many as the rescue ship was allowed to carry. The rest of the now empty lifeboats were left adrift at sea. Those salvaged were later given back to the White Star Line, the British shipping company which operated the Titanic. Strangely, after being returned, they appeared to have vanished from official records. The last image ever taken of the 13 surviving lifeboats was of them getting unloaded in the New York harbor. Sadly and ironically, that's where the Titanic was supposed to be on April 18, 1912. The lifeboats were then rid of their Titanic nameplates or any other markings that could have linked them to the ship. Some sources claim that the boats were eventually destroyed. But was this actually the truth? The fate of one particular lifeboat has been the source of much debate. Collapsible Boat A, the last one to leave the ship, was retrieved by the RMS Oceanic a month after the crash. At that time, it was a shocking 200 miles away from the spot where the Titanic had sunk. Also, in the boat, there was a wedding band engraved with the words "Edward to Gerda," a sad omen to a couple that were lost at sea after managing to escape the sinking Titanic. Later identified as Edward and Gerda Lindell, the couple was traveling from Sweden to the U.S. to relocate. Some accounts claimed that Mr. Lindell did, in fact, make it to Collapsible Boat A, but his wife wasn't as lucky. Neither were ever seen again, and the wedding band was eventually sent to Gerda's father. The recovery of Collapsible Boat A was recorded in both photographs taken by the crew on board the RMS Oceanic and by a detailed handwritten account of a fellow passenger. They claimed that the lifeboat had looked more like a piece of wood carried by the waves than an actual boat. The first lifeboat to depart from the Titanic was Lifeboat Number 7. It was dubbed the Millionaire Lifeboat. It's rumored that the 12 passengers on board might have bribed the crew to row away to safety instead of allowing others to jump in. In 2015, some of the items recovered from this lifeboat, including a lunch menu, a ticket, and a letter from one of the passengers, were auctioned for up to $70,000 by a New York auctioneer. Soon after the Titanic catastrophe, it became mandatory for all ships to be equipped with enough lifeboats to carry all the passengers and crew. It's more likely that the Titanic lifeboats, being relatively new equipment at the time, were refitted to be used on other ships, such as the RMS Olympic, which was the Titanic's older sister. Some of them may have been sold off to private collections, or even left to rot. After all, they were seen as a source of bad luck, and most people were unwilling to use them again on other ships. Unfortunately, all the information about their whereabouts is hard to confirm now. No official statement from the owners of the lifeboats was ever given after their rescue. But although nothing appears to have remained of the original lifeboats, some full-sized replicas exist on display in museums in Falmouth, England, and Belfast, Northern Ireland. One of the few surviving White Star Line lifeboats did not, in fact, belong to the Titanic, but it did have a striking connection to the cursed ship. This boat is the restored Lifeboat 6 from the RMS Oceanic, which helped to recover Titanic's collapsible Lifeboat C. It was said to be owned by a private collector, but similar to the Titanic's lifeboats, we don't know anything about its location today. As for the nameplates and other identification marks of the lifeboats, the White Star Line seems to have kept them. Because some of these items were later auctioned and sold to interested collectors, even Rick Springfield supposedly got hold of one of the nameplates. One particular nameplate was already missing by the time the White Star Line employees had reached the lifeboats. It was the nameplate of Lifeboat Number 8, which had been taken by a sailor named Thomas Jones. He later gifted it to another Titanic survivor, the Countess of Rothes, along with a letter acknowledging the bond they formed on the night of the shipwreck. You can find other similar items on display in different museums, such as Larne Museum and Arts Centre in Northern Ireland, or Worcester City Art Gallery and Museum. To be fair, some experts claim that even if there had been more lifeboats on board the Titanic, there simply might not have been enough time to launch them all. That's how severe the impact was. Many researchers say that everything was happening so rapidly after the ship had hit the iceberg that it's astonishing that so many passengers managed to survive. Meet Arthur John Priest. No, he isn't famous for being a painter or for discovering some long-lost treasure. He didn't invent some cool gadget or break any world records. No, Arthur John Priest is famous simply for being unsinkable. Proving one can be both lucky and unlucky at the same time, Priest was involved in, and survived, several mishaps at sea, including the fateful maiden voyage of the Titanic. Priest was not a rich man interested in sailing for pleasure. He was part of the working class, employed as a stoker or fireman, stuck for hours within the hot bowels of large steam-powered vessels. His job was dirty and difficult. He was responsible for keeping the furnaces lit, feeding them coal to ensure enough steam was produced for the engines to work. He had to be careful about not overheating the system or setting fire to the whole ship. The furnaces had to be carefully watched and constantly fed. He breathed it all in a while, working and fighting with the sweat and the dirt. He would often work shirtless because of the heat and was always covered in black coal dust. And when he finally had a break, his shared living quarters were nearby in the same part of the ship. He must have been good at his job, though, because he had no trouble finding work. But wherever he went, bad luck seemed to follow. The first incident was a mild one. As a young man, Priest worked on the RMS Asturias. The passenger liner first set sail in 1907, traveling between Southampton in the UK to Buenos Aires in Argentina. At some point during its maiden voyage, the ship suffered a small collision. The damage was bad enough that the ship returned for repairs. Thankfully, there were no reports of any serious injuries. Priest, unfazed, simply went to work on another ship, but his bad luck lingered on the Asturias. In 1914, the Asturias became a hospital ship, helping care for sick men and women around Europe while bringing them home to England. But in March 1917, at just around midnight, the ship was struck by a foreign object. Its hull was breached and the engine room flooded. The captain ordered everyone to abandon the ship, sending crew, patients, and health staff scrambling for the lifeboats. The vessel was still moving, powering through the water because the main controls, located within the flooded engine room, could not be turned off. The captain refused to leave the ship while people were still trying to escape. He was able to aim the Asturias towards Bolt Head, where it finally hit land and couldn't sink. The remaining lifeboats were lowered and the final survivors made it to safety. When they studied the damage on the ship later, the Asturias was declared a total write-off. It might be hard to pin this particular disaster on Priest. After all, he wasn't even on the ship at the time. But it seemed that many of the ships on which he served were destined for trouble. His bad luck followed him to his next job on the RMS Olympic, a massive ocean liner. The Olympic was big. In fact, it had been designed and built as part of the fleet that included the Titanic. But with size came sacrifice. The Olympic was great at moving in one direction, but very difficult to handle when it needed to turn. It was September 1911. The Olympic was trying to alter its course. The Hawk, a smaller ship sailing nearby, didn't give the larger vessel enough room to maneuver, and the two slammed into each other. Because the Hawk was engineered to deal with potential confrontations when out at sea, its reinforced bow tore through the Olympic. Two large gashes appeared on the ocean liner's side. The propeller shaft was badly twisted, and worse, the ship began to take on water. Somehow, the Olympic made it to shore without sinking, and nobody was seriously hurt. Priest had no idea that this was just a small taste of what his future held for him. He next found employment on a brand new ship, a better ship, an unsinkable marvel that was said to be the biggest vessel to have ever been built. Yes, he was going to work on the Titanic. And what a job! It took 29 boilers, requiring 850 tons of coal a day to produce enough steam to power the Titanic. Priest was just one of 150 stokers toiling away in the ship's underbelly, keeping those fires burning day and night. He made around $30 a month. But on April 14, 1912, he would find himself flung from a world of extreme heat to one of blistering cold. At approximately 11:35 p.m., the crew spotted an iceberg. The Titanic tried to avoid it, but the alarm had been sounded too late. 5 minutes later, the two collided. The iceberg tore through the hull, and the once watertight compartments inside were badly ruptured. As the cold Atlantic water flooded in, the ship began to sink. Distress signals were sent, but the closest ship, the Carpathia, was over 3 hours away. In the dark of night and stuck in the middle of nowhere, the crew and passengers panicked. Those who could scrambled for the lifeboats. Others jumped into the icy waters. In total, only 706 survived that terrible night. Priest, at the time of the collision, was down in the ship's lower quarters. He was on break, relaxing from a hard day of work. And as the ship went down, so did his chances of survival. He and his fellow workers were in the most dangerous position on the ship. They had to make their way through a maze of corridors and gangways, some of which were flooded, in a mad dash to the deck. And then they faced the frigid water, jumping in and desperately swimming to safety. The ocean was so cold that Priest even suffered frostbite before finding his way onto a lifeboat. He was one of only 44 stokers to survive that night. After an experience like that, most of us would never set foot on a boat again. But Priest had to work. His next job also ended in disaster. He was offered employment on the HMS Alcantara. It went down in 1916, and Priest was again one of the few to make it to safety. He was badly wounded in the process. But he kept pressing his luck, and his next job as a stoker may have felt eerily familiar. He would be working on a ship built by the same people behind both the Olympic and the Titanic. And this ship, named the Britannic, was the biggest of the three. It was also believed to be a superior vessel, fitted with new safety features after the Titanic sank. For example, it had 48 open lifeboats, 46 of which were the largest ever used on a ship before. 2 of these were even motorized and equipped with special communication devices. The good news? The Britannic survived its first trip without incident. It was already doing better than the Titanic ever did. However, on November 21st, 1916, the Britannic was shaken by a loud explosion while traveling through the key channel in the Aegean Sea. The hull was damaged, and some of the compartments began to fill with water. But, unlike the Titanic, the Britannic had been designed for just such an emergency. It had been fitted with 5 watertight bulkheads. Intact, these would help keep the ship safe and floating for a much longer period of time. But there was one issue. Portholes along the lower decks had foolishly been left open. As the ship tilted, the portholes let in water, which flooded the Britannic and hastened its descent into the sea. This effectively made those watertight bulkheads useless. The ship was going down fast, much faster, in fact, than the Titanic had sunk. 35 of the lifeboats were successfully launched, saving most on board. Of the 1,066 passengers and crew, 1,036 survived. Priest, his luck intact, was one of them. And yet, he still wasn't done with a life at sea. He accepted a position as a stoker on the Donegal. It was a smaller passenger ferry that had been converted for use as a hospital boat. In April 1917, it was struck by a foreign object while fleeing an unsafe situation, and though he suffered from a head injury, Priest was again one of the survivors. It took experiencing 2 collisions and 4 sinkings before Priest was finally ready to retire. In fact, he reportedly said he only gave it up because no one wanted to sail with him. Can you blame them? He would live out the rest of his life on dry land in Southampton, England, with his wife Annie and their 3 sons. But Arthur John Priest would always be remembered as the unsinkable stoker. Can you guess how many theories of the Titanic's sinking exist? Right, loads, including a theory of my own, which I'm going to share with you today. And then you can decide which one seems most likely to you. One Piece theory. The very first version of the events was the One Piece theory. It's very simple and basically claims that the sinking happened without any breakups. 2:15 a.m., the ship collides with an iceberg. 2:18 a.m., the lights go out. The ship reaches an angle of 45 degrees and then quickly begins its final plunge into the ocean depths. 2:20 a.m., only about 3 minutes later, the RMS Titanic disappears under the surface of the ocean for good. The liner doesn't break, it just goes down as a whole piece. Of course, this can't be true. In April 1912, the Titanic was not only the largest ship in the world, but also the largest ship ever built. It's hard to believe that such a heavy vessel could have gone down without breaking. That's just impossible. Well, I mean, you can't blame the theorists. Before we found the wreckage, there were no other theories. Wait a minute, or were there? The day after the disaster, the survivors gave their interviews. They talked about what had happened, and some of them claimed that the ship had actually broken in 2 when it had been flooded. For example, Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old boy, outlined the sinking as he remembered it. and L.D. Skidmon drew a sketch based on his description. The picture clearly showed the ship breaking in half. But no one believed Jack or other witnesses. There was no evidence, so their claims were received with a grain of salt. But in 1985, things changed. First breakup theory. That's when Robert Ballard found the wreckage of the Titanic in the depths of the ocean. When people saw the wreckage, it became clear that Jack and the other survivors had been right. The Titanic did indeed break in two when it sank. So it's time for a new theory. 2:15 a.m. The keel breaks, the starboard list eases, and the hull continues to bow and crumble. 2:17 a.m. The galley sections break off. The towers immediately drop under their own weight. The lights go out. The stern is pulled into the air. The bow breaks off and starts sinking. The aft is barely hanging on to the starboard side of the stern section superstructure. The stern section slowly lists over to port as it begins sinking again. It rises up one last time and pivots in a semicircle as it sinks. It all sounds pretty convincing, right? But people began to find plot holes in this theory. For example, the Titanic couldn't have held together until it reached such a high angle. The breakup would have had to begin much earlier. This only meant there was still a vast field for research and speculations. So people started to come up with their own possible scenarios. How about we look first at the ones no one likes? V-break and Aaron 1912 V-break. According to the first breakup theory, the Titanic reached a high angle, and the weight of its unsupported stern caused it to crack from the top down. But it's physically impossible. So, are there any other ideas? In 2006, Roger Long, a naval architect, decided to research a so-called V theory. 2:17 a.m. The breakup begins at a shallow angle, perhaps as little as 11 degrees. The upper structure fails and starts to crack. At this moment, only its double bottom is holding the Titanic together, but it starts to bend under the strain too, failing the ship. Water is pouring through the crack. It increases the weight in between the two sections, bending the Titanic the other way and pulling it into shape somewhat resemblant to the letter V. The upper decks get mangled and bent together. The bow heads for the bottom, and the stern is the last to sink. This theory has since been disproven many times, though. Roger Long believed it because the broken edges of the upper decks in the Titanic's bow section were all mangled and crushed. However, we have learned that it happened because of the so-called hydraulic downburst, the force of the water crashing into the deck as the Titanic hit the ocean floor. Another V-break theory states that the bow had risen out of the water after the break. This theory was mainly peddled by one former Titanic enthusiast. But not only has this theory been proved to be physically impossible due to the bow's incredible mass, it was also inspired by incorrect information. Remember Jack Thayer? Well, it was based on his sketch and the words of a couple of passengers. But the truth is, none of them had ever seen the Titanic break down like this. Jack himself even stated in an interview that the sketch was completely out of context to what he had actually seen. It was drawn by a passenger on the Carpathia, the ship that received the Titanic's distress signal and came to its aid. It couldn't be used as evidence. Now that we know this, let's move on to the theories that most people believe in. James Cameron's banana peel theory. Who hasn't seen the legendary movie about the Titanic, right? It became the leader of the 70th Academy Awards ceremony in the number of nominations and awards, and deservedly so. But did you know that James Cameron had been interested in the Titanic for many years and studied the ship's history? His books and research are very detailed, and he even came up with his own version of the events. It's called the banana split theory, and this is actually what you could see in the movie. Here's how it goes. The Titanic reaches a 23-degree angle and fractures down to the keel. The double bottom acts as a hinge as the stern falls down. When the double bottom fails, the bow and the stern separate. The stern lists to port, standing vertically, and then begins to go underwater. This theory is the most scientifically accurate one, along with Roy Mengat's theory. Wait, who's Roy Mengat? Mengat theory. Roy Mengat was an engineer who came up with the most plausible theory for the time being. 2:17 a.m. The lights go out on the Titanic. At this moment, the ship is at an angle of 20 to 23 degrees. Suddenly, the vessel snaps in two just around the third funnel. It causes the stern to settle into the water. The keel fails first. The draft and lower hull are crushed and break apart. Water surges into the bow and stern of the ship through the huge cracks, causing the bow section to sink beneath the waves. The stern rises up to the angle of 70 to 90 degrees, and then it sinks too. This theory seems to make the most sense, but it's quite controversial. The survivors who saw the breakup stated that the stern had settled back with the bow completely missing. Mengat's theory, however, contradicts that statement, while James Cameron's scenario takes this into account. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The truth must be somewhere in the middle. My version. Now, as promised, I'll provide you with my version of the events. Well, it's not really my theory, more like a combination of Roy Mengat's and James Cameron's ones. I believe that James Cameron was right about the breakup. 2:17 a.m. The ship is at a high angle. The lights go out. Then it snaps into two pieces. The bow starts sinking. The double bottom is still attached to the stern for a minute or so. Once the double bottom fails, the two parts separate and the bow goes down. Then, as Mengat said, the stern rises up at a high angle, and then it begins to sink vertically. It might have actually happened because the survivors stated that they had seen a clean break. This means it couldn't be hidden. And they had also seen the stern staying vertically in the air for a long enough time, probably a few minutes, before disappearing. Anyways, all of these are just speculations. Regardless of how the Titanic broke apart and sank, it was a great tragedy. It's already been 110 years since the Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank. Did you know that in 2022, the Blue Star Line Company is completing the construction of an exact replica of the Titanic? Called the Titanic II liner, the ship will be sent sailing along the same route with 2,400 people on board. Let's hope that everything goes well for them. Over a century ago, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Of the 2,240 people on board, only around 700 survived. Since then, the tragedy has been the subject of endless movies, documentaries, and books. And though we've learned a lot about the ship and many of the people on board, we hardly know anything about the iceberg responsible for the catastrophe, especially anything concerning its size. But maybe we can find some clues. The Titanic was constructed by the White Star Line as part of its new fleet of passenger liners. At the time, it was the largest ship ever built, and it lived up to its name. The ship was 883 feet long, equal to 2.5 soccer fields placed end to end, and 175 feet tall, which is close to 10 giraffes standing on top of one another. From the waterline to the deck alone, the boat was 60 feet high. That's close to the height of a 4-story building. The Titanic was big enough to have veranda cafes, a restaurant, a reading and writing room, a Turkish bath, a gym, and squash courts. There was even space for a swimming pool. The liner could carry a total of 3,300 people, including 2,435 passengers and 900 crew members. Although luxury was important, safety was paramount. The Titanic had been designed to have 16 watertight compartments below its deck. If the ship's hull was somehow compromised in an accident, up to 4 of these compartments could take on the water, while the remaining 12 would keep the ship afloat. Philip Franklin, vice president of the White Star Line, said this was what made the ship truly remarkable. It's believed that the man said, "There is no danger the Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." He was so very wrong. The ship left England for its first and last voyage on April 10, 1912. And all it took was a single iceberg to bring that mighty vessel down. Icebergs are fascinating. They are formed during a process called calving, when large chunks of freshwater ice break free from glaciers and float away into open water. They eventually melt away and disappear. In the northern hemisphere, the majority of these icebergs come from Greenland. In the south, they come from Antarctica. What you see on top of the water is only a small portion of an iceberg. This is just the tip. Most of it, up to 90%, is hidden under the water. Only when you examine pictures of the entire thing can you truly appreciate how massive icebergs are. It's the part of the iceberg you can't see that is often the most dangerous. Beneath the waves, it can have jagged edges in random places. A ship can easily get too close without realizing it, resulting in serious damage to the bottom of the boat. And it's not just big icebergs you have to watch out for. Smaller ones, which are more difficult to spot, can prove to be just as dangerous. A growler, for example, is under 7 feet long, with just a bit more than 3 feet showing above the water. And a slightly larger bergy bit is less than 15 feet in size. The dangers of icebergs were well known when the Titanic set sail. In 1901, the Islander was traveling through the inside passage to Alaska. It collided with an iceberg and sank immediately. Luckily, 138 of the 178 people on board made it to safety. Back then, there wasn't any special equipment for detecting icebergs. The best tool was your eyes. From a special vantage point above the ship called the crow's nest, 2 members of the crew had to stare out over the ocean and watch for potential hazards. The crow's nest was located at the front of the ship, 49 feet above the deck. It was attached to the mast. From this height, a person had a good view of the ocean. If they saw anything suspicious, they could ring a large bell to sound the alarm. After that, they could call from a special telephone to warn the captain of any danger. But imagine what a horrible job this would have been, especially on the night the Titanic sank. The crow's nest wasn't a warm and cozy room surrounded by windows. Instead, it was a large open tub exposed to the elements. On April 14, 1912, the air temperature was around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, which is close to freezing. With the ship moving at about 23 knots, more than 26 miles per hour, the sailors must have felt that frigid cold air pressing against any exposed skin. The only good thing about the job was that the shift only lasted 2 hours. Frederick Fleet was the sailor who actually spotted the iceberg that sank the Titanic. He was up in the crow's nest, working with Reginald Lee at the time. Fleet kept track of the left side of the ship, while Lee scanned the right. It was 10 p.m. when the 2 men started their shift. They had already been warned about the possibility of ice. But when you're cold and it's dark, it might feel like an impossible task. Even worse, the 2 men didn't even have binoculars to make the job any easier. Fleet would later insist that having binoculars would have prevented the tragedy. With about 20 minutes remaining on the job, the sailors noticed the iceberg. Fleet rang the bell, once, twice, and again. He then called up to the bridge to inform the crew. At first, the call seemed to come in the nick of time. The ship's engines reversed, and the massive ocean liner managed to turn. It wasn't enough to miss the iceberg, though. Ice showered down onto the ship's deck. The iceberg tore through the hull, and water flooded in. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the Titanic was gone. And here we have clue number 1. The iceberg was big enough to be spotted with the unaided eye in the dark of the night, without any binoculars. It was also tall enough for bits of ice to fall down onto the ship's deck. Since this all took place long before social media and smartphones, nobody on board would have been taking photos or videos at the time. So, of course, we don't have any footage of the actual iceberg. But there are photos of the possible iceberg from later that day. The SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing near the area on the morning of April 15, 1912. The steward on the ship had not yet heard about what had happened to the Titanic. But when he spotted an iceberg floating by, he was compelled to photograph it. Why? There was a line of red paint along the bottom of the iceberg, indicating that it had likely collided with a ship sometime within the previous 12 hours. A second photo was taken from a ship called the Minia. which was sent into the area to look for debris from the collision. Captain de Carteret said that among the wreckage, he had seen only one iceberg. He also noticed a streak of red paint on it. From the photos and witness accounts, newspaper reports estimated the iceberg to be 50 to 100 feet high and 200 to 400 feet long. That's clue number 2. The iceberg that hit the Titanic probably started its ocean journey from Greenland's coast, heading past the Baffin Bay to the Davis Strait. From here, it must have slipped through the Labrador Sea and finally reached the Atlantic. And that, in itself, is pretty impressive. The glaciers in Greenland create between 15,000 to 30,000 icebergs each year. Some small, some big. Of these, a mere 1% will actually make it to the Atlantic. The others simply melt along the way. We know that the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean, where the sinking took place, was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below freezing. For humans, this could cause frostbite or hypothermia. But that temperature is actually warm for an iceberg. Most would only last 2 to 3 years in the North Atlantic, slowly melting into the warmer water. Based on this, it's likely that the Titanic's iceberg left Greenland in 1910 or 1911 and was fully melted by late 1912 or 1913. But since it did make it to the Atlantic and managed to cause significant damage to the ship, we have clue number 3. We will never know for certain the size of the iceberg from that day, but we do know that it definitely wasn't a growler or a bergy bit. Both those types of icebergs are much too small. And if the ice was indeed scattered across the deck during the collision, the iceberg must have been a little taller than 60 feet. The newspaper estimates are probably as close as we're going to get. The iceberg that took down the Titanic was indeed a formidable one. And icebergs are still a threat. As recently as 2007, the cruise ship Explorer struck one and sank in Antarctica's Weddell Sea. Luckily, everybody survived. The International Ice Patrol was created in 1914 following the Titanic's sinking. The organization is still in operation today, made up of representatives from several countries. Using airplanes and radar, the patrol locates and tracks larger icebergs, making the information available to anyone who needs it and preventing more ocean tragedies in the process.
The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" The Titanic strikes the ice. Water starts flooding in. Third-class passengers are locked up. There aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Panic sets in. Violins are playing. The ship sinks. Well, we all know the story of the movie Titanic like the back of our hand by now. But what if I told you that Hollywood lied to us? To tell the real story of what happened that freezing night in 1912, we need to rewind a bit. The lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead!" Yep, that part was true. Just before 11:40 at night, Frederick Fleet noticed something darker than the sea directly ahead. As the ship got closer, he realized it was an iceberg. The engines were quickly reversed and the ship turned sharply. Instead of hitting it head-on, Titanic scraped along the side of the berg, sprinkling ice on the forward deck. If you remember, in the movie, Jack and Rose are having a romantic moment when they feel the ship shudder after hitting the iceberg. Everything shakes as if they were in the middle of a light earthquake. Some real-life passengers reported feeling something similar after the impact, but according to Titanic survivor Frank Prentice, it wasn't exactly like that. He said there was no impact as such, and it all felt more like slamming on your car brakes. The ship stopped, and that was that. Some people even slept right through the collision, confirming that there wasn't such an abrupt impact. Mr. Prentice, curious about what had happened, left his cabin and went out to the deck. When he got there, all he could see was a little ice on the surface, not the towering iceberg that Jack and Rose saw. But as we all know by now, the real damage happened below the waterline, where the iceberg had a jagged spur that slashed a 300-foot gash in Titanic's hull. Once the crew realized how severe the damage was, they immediately began sending distress calls to nearby ships, asking for help. At some point in the movie, the radio operator goes to the captain and says there is only one ship nearby, the RMS Carpathia, which later ends up rescuing many passengers. But in real life, there were more ships around. It's believed that the SS Californian was only about 23 miles away. This ship might have actually seen the Titanic sinking, or at the very least, seen its rockets exploding high in the sky. Yet, for reasons we will never fully understand, they didn't try to help. Let's get back to the story. Now, people need to get off the ship. At 12:45, lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered. Just like in the movie, women and children were told to go first. But in reality, some women were hesitant and even refused to get into the lifeboats. Mr. Prentice said this happened mainly for 2 reasons. First, these lifeboats were high and passengers were terrified of the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. And second, most women didn't believe the Titanic would actually sink. It was called unsinkable after all. So the idea of getting into a lifeboat seemed pointless at the time. This mindset probably explains why Eloise Smith, a first-class passenger, recalled that there was no panic or chaos at first. Other survivors backed this up, saying that no women or kids were crying. But one thing that was indeed concerning, at least for the crew, was the possibility that the lifeboats might buckle under too much weight. This is one of the theories why the first few lifeboats left carrying only a fraction of their full capacity. Like lifeboat number 7, which only carried 27 people in it, even though it could hold up to 65. In total, Titanic had 20 lifeboats, which could carry about half of the 2,200 people on board that night. But that didn't happen. And now we know the passengers had no idea there weren't enough for everyone. As women were calmly getting into the first lifeboats, musicians headed up to the deck. Their only goal was to play and keep the passengers calm. That's a pretty well-known fact. But the real story is that some survivors said they never saw or heard the band. No violinists whatsoever. It's not like Hollywood misled you though. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship had hit the iceberg. So maybe these passengers were just too panicked to notice the songs, or the musicians started playing later than we think. Now it's time to talk about the terrible treatment that third-class passengers received. The movie portrayed the crew as cruel, locking the less fortunate below deck like animals, giving them no chance to reach the lifeboats and save their lives. But the official inquiry into the disaster suggested that wasn't true. I mean, yes, fewer third-class passengers survived compared to those in first and second class, but there were other factors at play. Many third-class passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, clinging to their belongings, and had a harder time making their way up from the cabins, which were at extreme ends of the ship. Some survivors confirmed that they were not locked up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mrs. George Wabi, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, said that when chaos had erupted, some brave crew members and well-dressed first-class passengers had actually helped her get up to the first-class deck and eventually onto a lifeboat. At first, the Titanic was sinking slowly, bit by bit. Passengers reported seeing the water rising and hearing pops and cracks. Then, there was a loud boom. Some said there had been just one explosion, while others described it as a series of smaller explosions, which they'd thought had been the bulkheads giving way. And there's also a group of people who said they had only heard a rumbling sound. So not everyone agreed on the sound they had heard, but one thing is a fact. By 2:18 in the morning, the lights on Titanic went out, and the ship plunged into complete darkness. As the bow continued sinking, the stern rose out of the water, putting immense pressure on the middle of the ship. This caused the Titanic to break in two. In James Cameron's movie, this moment is pretty dramatic, with the ship sinking almost straight down into the water. But in reality, the break probably happened at a much lower angle, likely just below the waterline. Even so, it tilted enough that people couldn't stay on their feet and started sliding into the water. One interesting thing is that it wasn't until the wreckage was found in 1985 that it was finally confirmed the Titanic had broken apart. Up until then, survivors had given conflicting stories. At least 8 survivors claimed they had seen the ship split. Emily Ryerson, a first-class passenger, described it as if the Titanic had been sliced in half with a knife. But there was also a small number of witnesses that insisted Titanic had gone down intact. At the time, this theory was more accepted because most people still didn't believe that the supposedly indestructible ship could break in half. So why the conflicting reports? Okay, so what you don't see in the movies, for obvious reasons, is how incredibly dark it was when the tragedy happened. It was like being in a room with no light, where you can only make out shapes and shadows. That's what it was like on the lifeboats. This means passengers couldn't really see what was happening, and most of those who were close to the ship either lost their lives or were too focused on trying to survive to pay attention to the details of the wreck. Although James Cameron's film didn't fully capture how terrifyingly dark the disaster truly was, the 2012 TV series Titanic did a better job of showing the pitch-black horror of that night. Even then, the reality was much darker and more terrifying than either of these two productions could portray. Once a famous giant, the largest ship of that time, now 2 grand pieces lying on the ocean bottom about 2,000 feet apart, torn by the catastrophic collision of time itself. The stern of the Titanic got completely ruined after hitting the ocean floor, but you can still recognize the bow since many interiors were left preserved. There's a type of bacteria found on the ship's rusticles. A rusticle is this brownish formation of rust. It occurs deep underwater when the wrought iron the ship is made of oxidizes. It means the bacteria eat the iron of the Titanic's hull, piece by piece. And it seems they might finish their snack by 2030, way sooner than when anyone would expect the wreck to be gone forever. You may think it would probably be easier to take the wreck out of the water so that we got to keep it, but it would fall apart if anyone tried to do that. It's been in the water for more than 110 years now, and is now so rusty that no one would be able to reconstruct some parts even if we managed to get the ship out of the ocean depths. What do you think? Could any of about 700 people that had survived the sinking of the Titanic hear it hit the ocean bottom? The largest ship that had ever been made till then disappeared literally before their eyes after all. But sound most likely wouldn't have traveled from water to air. We can't hear that well in water because our bodies are not designed to hear in such environments. And although passengers were close to the sinking site, the Titanic still hit the bottom a long distance away, 12,500 feet. There are so many underwater landslides and earthquakes we cannot hear, and they make way more noise than a single ship slamming into the ocean floor. Most vibrations and sounds must have dispersed over a large area. Also, the downblast of water, which many believe hit the Titanic after it had touched the bottom of the ocean, would have pushed back the majority of the potential acoustic vibrations. Plus, the bottom of the ocean is not hard enough to produce such loud noises. Many survivors said they had heard terrifying noises as the Titanic was breaking apart, but none mentioned hearing anything after the ship disappeared below the surface of the water. Some survivors shared how chaotic it was when passengers, mainly women and children, were getting into lifeboats. There weren't enough boats, and still, some of them weren't even filled to their full capacity. No one knew how to react properly in such a situation. The lifeboat drill had been scheduled for the morning before the Titanic hit the iceberg, but for some reason, it got canceled. A giant ocean liner everyone believes is unsinkable takes a trip across the ocean. On its way, it strikes an iceberg and sinks. Yeah, we all know how the story goes. But what's scary is that it's also the plot of The Wreck of the Titan, a novel published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic went to the ocean bottom or was even constructed. In the novel, the Titan, what a scarily accurate name too, didn't have enough life jackets, vests, and lifeboats for all the passengers on board. It was also the largest ship of that time, almost identical in size to the Titanic, and both the Titan and Titanic sank in April. Dorothy Gibson was an American silent film actress. She was also one of the Titanic passengers. She survived the catastrophe. Right after she came to New York, she started filming Saved from the Titanic. The film was released only 1 month after the ship sank. Dorothy was even wearing the same shoes and clothes she had worn when she had actually been on the ship. The movie was successful, but it got destroyed in a fire, so it only exists in memories, like Jack Dawson. Titanic wasn't all alone in the restless waves of the cold ocean near the iceberg it struck. The SS Californian was relatively close. Their radio was shut off for that night though. At one moment, the crew members noticed mysterious lights in the sky. They immediately went to wake their captain up to tell him, but he issued no orders. Some believed it was just fireworks. They never realized it was actually a call for help. The flares crew members of the Titanic sent off to the sky, hoping someone would notice. By the time the SS Californian got the SOS message, it was already too late. Some say a full moon may have been the reason the iceberg crossed paths with the gigantic ship. A full moon may have caused incredibly strong tides that eventually sent multiple icebergs southward, right when the Titanic was crossing that area. Would you dare to taste cheese from the Titanic? The wreck has been under the ocean surface for more than 100 years now. It took more than 70 years to find it. By that time, most of the food that had gone down together with the ship had, of course, spoiled. But it's possible there's still some of it left. Some foods are protected from decay. For example, cheese. The microbes that turn milk into cheese create special conditions to protect the product from spoiling. Multiple things have survived the Titanic. A handwritten letter where a mother and a daughter wrote to the girl's grandma about the amazing journey they were on together. The letter has been around for more than 100 years and got sold at an auction. A battered pair of white cotton gloves was found in the wreck. Musicians on the Titanic played till the very last moment. Sheet music and one violin were found among the wreckage. The bell one of the crew members rang 3 times to warn there was a very close iceberg on their way. A pocket watch that stopped at 1:45 a.m., the time when the ship went under the water. Perhaps one person could have changed what happened on the Titanic. David Blair was a pretty lucky man. He was supposed to take the spot of the second officer of the Titanic. He was pulled out at the last moment, which eventually saved his life. It was a great thing for him, but something clouded his joy. What if he was the only person who could have done something to save the ship and the passengers? Back in the day, ships didn't have smart advanced technology like they do today. They couldn't see a threat on the horizon. Binoculars were pretty helpful, but the crew members on the Titanic didn't have access to the room where they were kept. David Blair was the man responsible for the keys. He left the ship in a hurry and forgot to hand over the keys that were in his pocket. Maybe if the crew members had had access to the binoculars, they would have seen the iceberg on time and had enough time to change course. It's possible that the giant iceberg that sent the Titanic to the ocean bottom was made of snow that had fallen in southwest Greenland. Scientists even used a computer model to calculate the paths the iceberg took in any given year, taking into consideration ocean currents and weather readings for that year. It's possible that the iceberg was 1,700 feet long, with a weight of around 75 tons. By the time it collided with the Titanic, it had dwindled down to only 1.5 tons. Violet Constance Jessup was, as many called her, Miss Unsinkable. She was only 24 years old when she joined the Titanic crew as a stewardess. On the tragic night when the ship struck the iceberg, she was lying in bed. As soon as she heard that something was going on, she got dressed and quickly went to the deck. Violet helped passengers get into lifeboats. 4 years later, she was on the Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship. Once again, the ship started sinking. Not only did the woman survive another accident, but she was also once again the one helping other people to escape the vessel before it disappeared below the surface.
Staying in the water that's 70 degrees Fahrenheit for a long time definitely won't do your health any good. A water temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit is a nightmare. It feels much colder than the air of the same temperature. The passengers of the Titanic were in 28 degrees Fahrenheit water. Can you imagine how cold it was? Even the iceberg that the Titanic met was warmer. The water didn't freeze because of the high salt content. But what if the temperature had been higher? What if the Titanic had sunk in warm water, say 120 degrees Fahrenheit? Theoretically, this could have happened had the waters of the North Atlantic met a warm undercurrent from the southern part of the ocean on disaster day. But this heat wouldn't have been enough. The ocean area is too vast, and the temperature is too low at night. The warm undercurrent alone wouldn't have made a difference for people who were overboard. But if the Titanic had sunk in another place at one particular moment, perhaps then all people could have been saved, thanks to an incredible natural phenomenon. Now, on board everybody, our voyage to a parallel universe begins. It's a moonless night on April 14th through 15th. The Titanic crashes into an iceberg. Icy water floods the lower decks. The captain sends a distress signal. The nearest rescue ship, Carpathia, is 58 miles away from the sinking Titanic. At maximum speed, Carpathia will get there in 4 hours. That's quite long, even in warm tropical waters, since your body loses heat anyway. The Titanic begins to sink. The crew downs lifeboats. Some of the passengers jump overboard. The ship is going under the water. There are no boats left, so you jump along with other passengers. It feels as if you got inside a huge iceberg. The water is so cold that it's hard for you to move. You can't even scream because there's no air in your lungs. But at this moment, you feel a pleasant warmth coming from the depths. The heat rises above your knees and waist, then reaches your neck. Finally, you regain control of your muscles and can breathe deeply. You notice that all the other passengers feel the same warmth. The water becomes a little hot. It makes you happy. But in a moment, horror replaces your delight. The ocean begins to foam. And not because of the high temperature, but because something is rising from the ocean floor. You hear a heavy, low sound coming from the depths. It's not a sinking Titanic, but something bigger. You can see a huge iceberg nearby. It's melting, and a huge chunk is breaking off from it. 1 million bubbles appear on the surface. Then you feel something hit you in the leg. Thousands of strange lightweight rocks are rising from below. There are also massive plates among them. People use them as lifeboats. You climb on one of those rocks and look at the ship. It doesn't sink, since all the water is bubbling and pushing the vessel up. You take one of the small rocks and understand everything. It's pumice. An underwater volcano has woken up right under the ship. Thousands of tons of volcanic rock are floating to the surface. When it erupts, its magma shakes the entire space, heats the water, and destroys the seabed. But it doesn't result in anything destructive on the surface. The enormous pressure of hundreds of millions of gallons of water suppresses the volcano's power. Molten rocks of the Earth's crust are pressed against the seabed, and pumice rises to the surface. And here's why it happens. The upper part of Earth consists of many solid parts, tectonic plates. These plates collide with each other and divide. And when one part separates from another, the magma immediately comes up. So, all volcanoes are these unstable fault sites. If the Titanic had sailed over one of these areas during an eruption, many passengers would have been saved. Back in the parallel universe, you notice the Titanic starts sinking again. The water is no longer bubbling. The volcano has gone out. In a matter of seconds, the ocean turns icy again. Fortunately, you have your pumice lifeboat. This is enough to wait for rescuers. But let's imagine a situation with no underwater volcano and an iceberg. A situation when the water was warm from the very beginning. One of the engines in the motor compartment of the ship breaks down. Several pipes burst because of increased pressure, and now there's a crack in the ship's body. Water is filling the lower decks. The ship is sinking. People evacuate on lifeboats. There's less panic since the night is warm and no one is freezing. Each passenger gets a life jacket. The ship is breaking. You understand that you have to jump. The Titanic goes underwater. Many passengers fall overboard in horror. They dive into the dark ocean and immediately come to the surface. Panic and complete chaos take over. The ship disappears in the dark, and finally, it's all silent. A few minutes pass, and you notice there's no panic at all. The water is warm. Almost all passengers have life jackets. Someone is floating on the wooden ship wreckage. After a couple of hours, the water no longer seems so comfortable. The ocean takes away your body heat. To keep warm, passengers swim closer to each other in a tight circle. Yeah, now it's quite possible to wait for another couple of hours till the rescuers come. People on lifeboats sail closer and take those who freeze on board. Passengers take turns, 20 minutes in the water, then 20 minutes in boats. It's essential not to take your clothes off. Even a wet outfit helps keep your body warm for longer. And when it seems that everyone is saved, somebody screams. A girl in a boat looks scared. She trembles with fear and points her finger into the black water. Passengers try to see what's there and notice a triangular fin. 1, 2, 3. There are so many of them! The noise of the sinking ship has attracted a group of sharks, and now they are circling the survivors, hoping to satisfy their hunger. They're swimming slowly. It doesn't look like they're going to attack. But you should keep your eyes open, as these fish are some of the world's most aggressive and dangerous sharks, the bull sharks. They can be agile, fast, and unpredictable. They don't swim in the cold waters of the Atlantic, but the water in this parallel universe is perfect for them. The sharks are strong and sturdy. They create the illusion of slowness to relax their prey. They're called bull sharks because of their short, blunt muzzle, like that of a bull, and they like to hit a target or other sharks with their forehead. Several fish are ramming boats. Someone falls into the water. Fortunately, people help them back on board. The sharks aren't going to retreat. Chaos and panic ensue. People are screaming and splashing the water with paddles to scare away the fish, but it doesn't help. One of the sharks opens its toothy mouth and clings to a boat. At this moment, you notice more fins nearby. A pack of great white sharks arrives at the party. They are some of the most dangerous animals on the planet. They're big, fast, and strong, and their 300 triangular teeth lined in several rows are sharp as blades. Great white sharks swim around the boats and scare away the bull sharks. You fall off the boat and see a big fin approaching you. Fear awakens the survival instinct in you. You're trying your best to swim away from the shark as far as possible. Of course, it's useless, since the shark is much faster and will definitely catch you. You feel your foot touching the shark's nose. The other foot gets into the toothy mouth. You scream in horror. After a second, the shark lets you go. Great white sharks rarely attack people. If they bite, it's just to test you. After all, the shark's favorite prey is seals. It simply loses interest if it realizes you aren't a seal. But if the shark is starving, it doesn't matter to it what kind of prey you are. Lucky for you, this one is not like that. Those survivors in the boats have almost nothing to fear either. Great white sharks don't attack them. They can push boats slightly, but only to test them. The great white shark is swimming away from you. But a bull one appears, and it looks like it's hungry. The shark is swimming towards you, opens its mouth, and a loud ship horn penetrates the water. This is the RMS Carpathia that has come to the rescue. All the sharks swim away scared. All passengers are saved. Back in our universe, another ship that had been nearby could have saved the passengers much earlier. But that's another story.
They were on their way to the New World when a rendezvous with an iceberg crushed all of their dreams and hopes. There was panic and tears and heartbreaking goodbyes, like that of Jack and Rose. Or was there? Let's see how well you know the real story of Titanic. The love story of Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater was inspired by true events. What do you say? Is it a myth or a fact? The most emotional Titanic love story was actually all made up by the screenwriter and director of the famous movie, James Cameron. Some passengers featured in the movie were real though, and by a mere coincidence, there was a J. Dawson on board. His name was Joseph, not Jack, and he worked as a coal trimmer. The most expensive object lost with the Titanic was a painting by Pablo Picasso. What's your take on this one? It's a myth. Another one given to us by the famous movie. The most valuable item that went down with the Titanic was probably a Mary Joseph Blondel painting, created in 1814. Some other valuable items were a violin that belonged to Wallace Hartley, the musician who insisted that they had to play till the very last moment. There was also a 1912 Renault Type CB Coupe de Ville that would now cost millions of dollars, a handwritten manuscript by Joseph Conrad, first edition essays by Francis Bacon, 5 Steinway grand pianos, and, of course, some fine china plates and cups and first-class passengers' jewelry. The Titanic was the largest and the most luxurious passenger ship of its time. Does it sound real to you? Yep, it's totally true. In April 1912, the Titanic was the largest ship ever built. It was 882 feet long and had a maximum passenger capacity of 2,435 people. That's not a lot compared to the largest cruise ship of today, the Symphony of the Seas. It's just a bit longer than the Titanic, but has more than double the passenger numbers. And yes, no other cruise liner has probably beaten the Titanic in terms of luxury to this day. It costs more than $200 million to build in today's money. The tickets were also quite expensive. Duh! First-class tickets ranged in price from $1,700 in today's money for a berth up to $50,000 for one of the 2 parlor suites. Second-class tickets were $700. Third-class passengers had to pay between $170 to $460. Most of the passengers of the unsinkable ship managed to survive. True or false? Sadly, it's false. Only 37% of all the passengers actually survived the meeting with the Titanic. Around 61% of the first-class passengers, 42% of the second-class passengers, and 24% of the third-class passengers made it out alive. The Titanic was passing through the Bermuda Triangle when things went wrong, and that's probably why it sunk. What do you say? Myth or reality? It's 100% a myth. The Titanic never even came close to the Bermuda Triangle. The liner sank about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, which is a huge distance to the north of Bermuda, the infamous area where ships and planes disappear without a trace. We might have the moon to blame for the sinking of the Titanic. True or false? This one is true. The moon heavily affects the tides on Earth. The closer the moon is to the Earth, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of our satellite. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide, the alignment of the moon, the sun, and the Earth that makes their combined gravity reach its peak twice a month. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. Icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers drift off to the coastal waters of Labrador and Newfoundland, where they often run aground. To move on, they need to either melt and become lighter or catch a high tide that would carry them further. The 1912's tide was as high as it gets. So they shifted many shipping routes south because of the huge amount of icebergs. But not the Titanic, of course, as they believed it was unsinkable. It took 4 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to sink. What do you say? It's false, and if you're a Titanic expert, you definitely know it was actually 2 hours and 40 minutes. And this was slow enough, given the damage caused by the iceberg. It didn't sink faster, thanks to the ship's construction. There were 16 watertight compartments in the lower part of the ship. They worked as a lifeline. When the iceberg crashed into the hull, it broke into 6 boxes. The Titanic could have stayed afloat only if 4 compartments had been damaged. Water filled the first 6 compartments within 1 hour. During this time, the ship tilted slightly to the right side. Then, water began to flood the 7th box when all 6 boxes were filled. And from that moment, the sinking rate was growing with every second. The ship's bow sank under the water, and then the stern filled up. One of the leading reasons for the Titanic tragedy was signal rockets. True or false? What's your take on it? This one is true. When any ship sinks, the crew members must release red flares. It's a signal to all nearby ships that someone is in trouble. But for an unknown reason, someone put white lights in the Titanic's rocket box. When the ship crashed into an iceberg, the crew members released white flares. Another ship, SS Californian, was nearby at the time. Its captain knew the Titanic was going through a dangerous iceberg area. The crew of this ship didn't see the Titanic in the dark, but they noticed white rockets. Radio communication between the vessels didn't work. The SS Californian operator turned off the receiver. The Californian captain felt that something was wrong, so he sent a Morse lamp signal to the Titanic. But it was too late. The ship was already underwater, so no one could respond. Another ship, Samson, was sailing alongside the Titanic. It drifted with lights off since it was catching seals, and that's not legal. When the captain saw the Titanic's white rockets, he thought it was the Coast Guard. So Samson sailed away as fast as they could. They realized they had abandoned the drowning passengers once they made it to Iceland and learned the horrible news. In 1996, one expedition managed to raise the Titanic from the ocean floor. Do you believe it? If you don't, you're right. There were different ideas on how to raise the Titanic, from doing it with compressed air to putting it in wire mesh and covering it with liquid nitrogen, or using giant magnets. The only real attempt to raise the Titanic was made in 1996, and it failed dramatically. The expedition's goal was to lift a part of its hull, weighing about 21 tons. It would still have been the largest piece to see the sunlight again, if the operation had succeeded, that is. They lowered 4 large bags filled with diesel fuel to the bottom of the ocean and attached them to the hull plate. Then, the fuel bags were released and they started lifting the pieces on their own. The plate was about 200 feet below the surface when the weather got rough. The expedition members decided to tow the part to calmer waters around 80 miles away. Long before they reached the towing destination, half of the plate broke off and sank to the bottom again. 2 of the lifting bags seemed to have broken loose, and the hull went down. The Titanic will most likely crumble to dust halfway up if someone tries lifting it again. So, how many correct answers do you have? Let me know in the comments below. There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy. and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going, cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
Exclusive photographs, by far the best yet, are in from the Titanic. For most of this century,
When the first images of the Titanic shipwreck appeared in September 1985, the world stopped. People were glued to their TVs, watching the legendary ship reappear after more than 70 years. Where did the Titanic sink, you ask? It's located about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. This so-called unsinkable ship rests in complete darkness, about 12,600 feet below the surface. Yep, that's how deep the Titanic is. But even after such a long fall down to the ocean floor, the front part, known as the bow, still looks surprisingly intact. I mean, the railings were still there, the anchor chains too, even the elegant curves of the hull you might recognize from old photos. But the news barely mentioned the stern back then. And there's a reason we still don't talk much about it. You see, these images were about more than just capturing mesmerizing and eerie footage. They were proof of what really happened when the Titanic sank. We were finally getting some answers about this 1912 disaster, when more than 1,600 people lost their lives. And before you Google how many people survived the Titanic, I'll tell you, 706. Among those survivors, several claimed they saw the ship break apart as it went down. Others insisted it sank in one piece, and in the end, investigators agreed with them. Back then, official reports concluded that Titanic had gone down intact. So, for 73 years, that was the official story, until we finally saw the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean. When the Titanic underwater photos were released, they confirmed it. Yes, the liner really did break apart as it sank. And if we've just seen those images of the bow, that means the stern must be around there too, right? Well, kind of. I mean, we did find it. It's located about 2,000 feet away from the bow, lying on the ocean floor. So yes, it exists. But why doesn't anyone ever talk about what happened to the stern of the Titanic? Well, there's a big reason for that. See, the bow, even after all the damage from hitting the seafloor, still looks recognizable. Many of its interiors are surprisingly well preserved, and it's lying as if the ship was continuing its voyage. But the stern is destroyed. Today it's more like a twisted tangle of steel that barely looks like a ship at all. Only the parts that are more resilient, like the propellers, reciprocating engines, and rudder, have managed to hold their shape, but the rest of the stern section is melting into the seafloor. Yet, to understand why it's in such a terrible state, we need to go back to that freezing night of April 15, 1912, the night of the Titanic wreck. Just hours before the tragedy, Titanic was still sailing smoothly across the cold North Atlantic. The stern was alive with people, families talking, music playing, life going on as usual. This is where the room for passengers with the cheapest tickets were located. That's why third-class travelers were also known as steerage passengers. But the stern wasn't only for passengers. It also contained many of the ship's storage areas, including cargo holds, baggage rooms, kitchens, crew quarters, and even the engineering spaces. And hold on to that info, it's going to be important in a second. So let's jump straight to when the liner struck the iceberg. As the bow began to sink, the stern slowly lifted out of the water, putting enormous strain on the middle of the ship. By around 2 in the morning, the lights on Titanic flickered and then went out. Moments later, the ship broke in two, and the bow disappeared beneath the waves. The stern briefly settled back on the water before rising again, this time almost vertical. It stayed upright for a few seconds and then began its final plunge. At about 2:20 in the morning, the stern vanished beneath the Atlantic. Titanic was gone. What was happening beneath the water were two completely different scenarios. First, the bow slowly filled with water and began to drift downward, almost sailing gently like a submarine. Because of that, it managed to keep its shape and stayed mostly intact. But Titanic's stern collapse was a whole different story. The stern was ripped wide open where the ship had split apart. Water rushed in through that open end at incredible speed. This sudden flooding made the stern plunge downward much faster than the bow. The rush of water created so much turbulence that pieces were ripped off and scattered all around the ocean floor. Now, remember what I said earlier about the spaces inside the stern? Those huge storage areas were wide open, and many of them contained air pockets. So when the stern section broke away, it still had compartments filled with trapped air. As it spun down into the depths, this increasing water pressure crushed those pockets one by one. The surrounding structure began to implode, scattering pieces of metal, furniture, statues, and passengers' belongings across the ocean floor. So many experts believe the immense water pressure made that section collapse as it sank, and that's why we can't see much of it today. And now you know the answer to the Titanic back section mystery. We don't talk about it much, simply because there's not much left to see. It's like the part of the Titanic story that's too broken or too painful to talk about openly. The side of the ship that truly feels lost. And sorry to say this, but that's the future of the bow, too. I mean, it won't be there forever. The iconic shape of the wreck is changing year after year, and not in a good way. The front part of the Titanic is deteriorating, and one day it'll be entirely gone. Down on the seabed, the Titanic faces enormous pressure, nearly 390 times greater than at the surface. The good news is there aren't any air pockets left inside the ship, so big implosions won't happen again. But the bad news is that the ship's own weight is now helping to tear it apart. As those 52,000 tons of steel slowly settle into the ocean floor, they twist and pull on the hull. Submersible missions have already spotted large cracks running through the steel plates, and even the decks themselves are starting to cave in. And there's something else. The wreck might look cool and spooky today, but that actually comes from a thick layer of bacteria and microbes covering it. The problem is, they're slowly eating the Titanic. Yep, most of the corrosion happening down there is caused by bacteria, and this is gradually weakening the entire structure. Steel plates, beams, and supports are getting thinner every year. Scientists estimate that the ship is losing between 0.13 and 0.2 tons of iron every single day. Still, even at that rate, the wreck won't vanish overnight. Experts believe it could take up to 420 years for the liner to disappear completely. Until then, we'll keep watching this sad but natural process unfold. Parts of the ship have been falling apart little by little since the night when Titanic sank, and a lot has already changed since we started taking underwater photos, like the railing sections that have dropped and the ceiling in the captain's bathroom that's collapsed. That's why so many expeditions are now focused on capturing footage and detailed scans of the Titanic shipwreck to preserve its memory before the ocean takes it all. It's our way of keeping the story alive, even as time and nature continue their quiet work. Maybe those hungry bacteria can take a break from their buffet, so that Titanic can rest in peace with many more years to come. No one could ever have imagined that the unsinkable Titanic would collide with an iceberg, except for one man, William Thomas Stead. Well, not directly, of course. It's not like he jolted out of bed one day, envisioning the fall of the Titanic. Rather, he wrote an empowering short story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor on March 3, 1886, 26 years before Titanic sank. Okay, let's do a super quick recap. Titanic was traveling from Southampton to New York in April 1912 in the North Atlantic. The ship hit an iceberg, and less than 3 hours later, it was completely underwater. Out of 2,208 people on board, just 706 survived due to the limited number of lifeboats and icy cold water. Another passenger ship, Carpathia, heard the distress call, picked up the survivors, and brought them safely to New York. The short story William Stead wrote was about Thomas, a British sailor, who got on a passenger liner bound for the U.S. At one point, the protagonist realized there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board the ship in case something happened. A couple of days later, heavy fog covered everything in sight. Luck was not on the liner's side, and it collided with a stray ship, just like Titanic struck an iceberg. Only 200 out of the 916 people made it safely to the U.S. The main character managed to survive by jumping into the water and climbing into one of the lifeboats. Now, you'd think that the story riled up everyone in the industry to add extra lifeboats on ships. But sadly, it received very little attention when it was published. Even more tragically, William Thomas Stead was on Titanic when it sank, and he didn't make it. The survivors who knew Stead mentioned that he had always been cheerful and had loved to chat during meals. He complimented the ship's design and how sturdy it was. Witnesses also talked about how he had been helpful when the ship had been sinking, having given his life jacket to someone else. He was a journalist by profession and was on his way to New York for a ceremony. One of his most important contributions to modern journalism was the use of illustrations in every newspaper article. He also introduced newspaper interviews, and they're still used to this day along with illustrations. But this story wasn't the only published work that predicted the disaster. Morgan Robertson was an author and former ship captain who wrote short stories and novels. His most notable novella is The Wreck of the Titan. It's also known as Futility. The book was written in 1898, 14 years before Titanic. It was a fictional story about the Titan, an ocean liner similar to Titanic, which was crossing the North Atlantic. It's also a coincidence that Titan was just as fast as Titanic and shared many other similarities, like size and design. The book described it as unsinkable and the largest ship to hit the ocean at the time. That's what they said about Titanic, too. Another eerie similarity was the limited number of lifeboats it had. The story took place in April, and that's when Titanic set off on its journey and hit the iceberg. The Titan story also mentioned that barely anyone had survived that horrible accident. Unlike Stead's story, the protagonist of Robertson took a different path. The Titan sinking happened somewhere halfway through the book, so after the accident, the main character went on with his life. The book was brought back into the spotlight after the Titanic disaster. How could someone describe the events that took place almost a decade later so accurately? Many started to believe Robertson could see the future. But the reality was that Robertson knew his way around a ship. It was easy for him to write down the nitty-gritty of things without doing more research. Realistically, one of the biggest threats for ships at that time was hitting an iceberg or colliding with other ships. The next story sounds somewhat mysterious. Once, Alex Mackenzie heard a voice that warned him not to board Titanic. But when he turned around, there was nobody there. As he continued walking, the voice spoke to him again. But this time, it was louder and more distinct. He took the warning seriously and decided to cancel the trip and go back to Glasgow, Scotland, his hometown. His grandparents weren't too happy to find him back home instead of on Titanic. After all, the ticket was very expensive. That disappointment very soon disappeared when they heard that the ship had struck an iceberg. John Coffey was a member of the crew of Titanic, but he decided to ditch the ride when the ship stopped at his hometown in Queenstown, Ireland. His inner voice told him to get off the liner, and he did. He was only 23 at the time, and for someone his age, it could be a major career boost and an opportunity to grow. Despite the horrible tragedy, the guy signed to work with the RMS Mauritania just months after the Titanic sinking. Talk about commitment. Some added info was revealed about what may have contributed to the fall of Titanic. The constructors insisted that the ship was unsinkable, but many people later theorized that the vessel's steel plates had been too frail for the freezing Atlantic water. It may have caused the rivets to pop, allowing ocean water to seep inside. Another theory is that there may have been a fire in the hull of the Titanic that had been raging for 3 weeks before the voyage. The fire softened the steel, allowing the iceberg to cut through it like a hot knife through butter. Some pictures before the ship set off on its journey show black marks on the hull, which could have been caused by fire. Either way, the iceberg would have caused significant damage in any case, no matter if there was a fire or not. Some people also blame those who designed the Titanic. The ship was built with large joints at the bottom, which probably snapped easily during the collision. Of course, these are all theories, but we know for a fact that the iceberg was the main character of this drama, and that the works of Stead and Robertson should have been taken seriously. Either way, this should be a lesson for the future, helping to prevent similar tragic accidents. By the way, ocean liners and passenger ships wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, he invented a steam engine that was so strong it could produce enough energy to power a ship. And a century later, in 1819, the first steamship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, UK. It only took the vessel 29 days to cross the ocean. The passenger ship industry boomed in the early 1900s when it became easier for people to move to America or go on holidays. As decades rolled by, the use of aircraft stole the spotlight from passenger ships, since planes were faster and more efficient. Nowadays, it's quite rare for a passenger ship to collide with anything in open water. Modern technologies can detect anything that can pose a threat and even predict stormy weather. Cruise ships these days are giants compared to the vessels of Titanic's era. Modern ships can carry almost twice the number of passengers and have amenities folks back then could only dream of. Most cruise ships these days have several restaurants to choose from, multiple swimming pools, and game rooms to catch a break. If you're in the mood for some fun, you can watch live performances. Don't forget about the helicopter pad, because why not? Don't worry if you start feeling unwell. The in-house doctors are always there to help any passenger in need. And these ships are only going to get bigger. Putting Titanic and a modern cruise ship side by side is like comparing a Corgi to a Doberman. Back then, Titanic was the biggest and most cutting-edge vessel anyone could dream of. So, who knows what the future of cruise ships can hold? We might even have entire cities floating around. That would be a really big boat.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
Congratulations! You can now forget everything you've seen in the movies or everything you've read in books and newspapers and heard from people. Now we have the most detailed and reliable study of the famous sunken ship. A large-scale Titanic 3D scan allows us to see in fine detail everything that happened during the disaster. And rest assured, there was a lot going on there that you've never heard of. Are you ready for Titanic new discoveries? Let's go! There's a fat chance, or a thin chance, take your pick, that there are no people here who haven't heard of what happened. But just in case, here's the quick backstory. On April 10, 1912, the giant cruise ship Titanic sailed from Southampton, England to New York City. 4 days later, the ship collided with an iceberg and sank in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. It was one of the most tragic and biggest disasters in the history of sea voyages. Since then, the wreck of the giant ship has been lying under a layer of icy water. For decades, people wanted to get this ship from the bottom many times, but they never fully tried. Passenger stories, documentaries, and books have given us a complete picture of what happened. But the only witness that can tell us about those tragic events is the ship itself. And some people decided to ask it about that night. A group of experts, oceanographers and cinematographers, recreated a virtual version of the events and showed it in the documentary Titanic: The Digital Resurrection. This is the most detailed digital reconstruction of how the Titanic sank ever made. To create it, specialists from the Magellan Company sent marine robots to the bottom where the ship lies at a depth of 12,500 feet. In such a place, all objects experience immense water pressure. To better understand how great it is, imagine the weight of a heavy barbell on your fingertip. Experienced divers with standard scuba gear can only swim at depths up to 130 feet and a little deeper. So it's a challenging, almost impossible mission to descend to such a depth and conduct research. It's dangerous for people. That's why the team of specialists sent robots there. Equipped with cameras for deep-sea surveys, they took more than 700,000 photos and videos in 4K resolution. They were collecting data for 3 weeks, exploring every part of the ship. Eventually, they had about 16 terabytes of data. Now, 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. Is that a lot? The largest game on PC, Microsoft Flight Simulator, weighs about ½ terabyte, and it has maps of the entire planet to create a realistic flight simulator. Still, this huge program weighs 32 times less than that Titanic scan. Imagine how detailed the model of the ship and the simulation of the disaster turned out to be. Moreover, the team combined all this information with the drawings of the ship. They calculated the speed of Titanic that night, its direction, its position, and the angle of impact with the iceberg. All of this was uploaded to supercomputers to create precise crash simulations. After that, specialists studied eyewitness reports, got consultations from historians and maritime experts, and then presented a detailed staging of the tragic night. Some things turned out to be different from what you know about them. For example, the iceberg didn't make a huge hole in the side of the ship. A Titanic wreckage scan shows that a piece of ice had struck a glancing blow and created several holes in the hull. Each of them was the size of an A4 sheet of paper. How could such minor damage destroy a giant ship? The problem was that those A4-sized punctures covered the entire length of the case. The Titanic's creators claimed that it was the most unsinkable ship in the world. However, its unsinkability lay in the fact that it could stay afloat even if 4 of its watertight compartments got flooded. But the collision with the iceberg led to the flooding of 6 of them. The iceberg had a mere 6.3 seconds of contact with the ship and still managed to sink it. The Titanic wreckage scan also showed a portal with a broken window. The iceberg probably crashed in there. This finding confirms the words of eyewitnesses that pieces of ice got into the cabins. Just imagine how frightening that was. You're sleeping peacefully in your bed, then you hear a loud crash, and a piece of iceberg falls into your cabin. And after that, absolute chaos begins. The researchers found out exactly how the ship had split in half. In the famous movie, we all saw how the back of the ship had risen above the water and then broken off. The ship indeed broke, but not as gently as we saw on the screen. Yeah, the scale of the disaster was terrible, but the reality was even worse. The ship wasn't just broken, it was torn in two. Wooden and metal parts of the ship, pipes, chunks of the hull, walls, everything was torn and bent. The first-class cabins were torn in two. Imagine the screeching of metal that sounded on that cold night. Researchers compared other Titanic facts versus the movie. One of them was a story about First Officer William Murdoch. In the movie, his character attacked passengers who were trying to board the boat. But in reality, everything happened differently. Titanic survivor Charles Lightoller said William Murdoch had drowned when he was trying to lower a lifeboat into the water. He didn't attack anybody, but still faced a tragic fate. There are no exact details, but high-resolution scans have confirmed this version. But one of the most impressive and heroic tales that happened on the Titanic occurred in the boiler room. With the help of robots, experts discovered that one of the boat's steam valves had been left open. This finding only confirms eyewitness stories that the engineers stayed in the boiler room for more than 2 hours after the collision with the icebergs. This group of brave people maintained a power supply until the very end. Why did they do it? Proper lighting on the Titanic helped people safely lower the boats onto the water. Electric power also made the Titanic visible to distant ships. Moreover, passengers reported that the Titanic's lights were on even when it was submerged underwater. The brave feat of the engineers helped save hundreds of passengers' lives. Who knows, perhaps further research of the ship will tell us more about other heroic actions of the passengers and crew members. Actions that will be worth making a movie about. In addition to studying the ship, the researchers also scanned the seabed around the wreckage, where not only parts of the Titanic, but also personal belongings of passengers, including gold coins, pocket watches, combs, shoes, and so on, were scattered. By the way, many of those items have been raised from the bottom and sold at various auctions. You can also see some artifacts from the ship in specialized museums. One of those is called Titanic Belfast and is located in Northern Ireland. It is open to the public. A digital replica of the ship not only shows us how the Titanic sank, but also literally saves the ship. The condition of the wreckage is getting worse every day. Gigantic pressure, cold temperature, water, and marine life, all of this is slowly destroying the vessel. Oh yeah, some companies that organize dive trips to the ship for tourists also pose a danger to the ship. It turns out that there are a lot of people who wanted to go down inside a submersible to the legendary wreck. As a result of some of these excursions, parts of the ship were damaged. Experts predict that within the next 40 years, the unlucky liner may disappear completely. Fortunately, the Titanic 3D scan has provided such a level of detail that you can imagine walking inside it. This means that the tragedy will never be forgotten. Of course, 10 videos like this one won't be enough to cover the full scope of the work that the filmmakers have done. Fortunately, the documentary, Titanic: The Digital Resurrection, is available for viewing. You can watch the movie and also study the 3D models of the ship. Who knows? Perhaps you can make new discoveries. In the Titanic movie, you won't see any fumes above the fourth funnel of the legendary ocean liner, and it's not a mistake. Back in 1911, the year before the Dream ship's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the fourth was added for balance and more impressive looks. The White Star Line thought the public would have been disappointed to see only 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The Titanic's sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic, also had 1 fake funnel each for the same reason. The dummy chimney wasn't completely useless and served for ventilation. It took out the fumes from the machine spaces in the lower decks and from one of the first-class general rooms. 1 big ventilation funnel, instead of several small ones, helped to declutter the upper decks and left more open space for passengers to enjoy their strolls. When Titanic went down, the funnels, each weighing 60 tons, went down with the rest of the ship. They were made extra tall to make sure the passengers weren't covered in the suit being ejected. Their height and weight let them stay in the upright position. The forward funnel, followed by the others, fell only when the ship went for the final dive. Those chimneys were much lighter than the bow, so they spread among other debris. The light material they were made of flattened once it hit the bottom, and the iron-eating bacteria living deep down took care of it later. The bow of Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled. When the famous ocean liner hit that iceberg, things got really messy. It took the future movie star a whole 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others, and it was chaos because these compartments were only watertight horizontally. Soon enough, water started flooding through the anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking, and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went underwater, and the stern shot up almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china or falling gear. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing almost 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. The bow was cruising down at about 13 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost a half an hour before the stern. The two parts of the Titanic now lie 2,000 feet apart, pointing in different directions. The bow remained mostly intact, just covered in mud. The stern turned into a tangled wreck because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Signal rockets played a big part in the Titanic's tragedy. When a ship goes down, you're supposed to shoot up red flares to signal trouble. But someone decided to stock Titanic with white lights instead of the usual red ones. So when the ship smacked into that iceberg, the crew fired off white flares. The SS Californian was passing nearby, and his captain knew the Titanic was in a dangerous iceberg zone. The crew didn't spot the sinking Titanic, but they sure saw those white rockets. The radio between the ships was useless because the Californian's operator switched it off. The captain had a gut feeling something was off, so he flashed a Morse code light signal at Titanic. But he received no reply because the Titanic had already gone underwater. There was another ship, Samson, sailing alongside the Titanic. It had plenty of illegally hunted frozen seal meat from Canadian waters abroad, so it was sailing with lights off to remain unnoticed. When they saw the Titanic's white rockets, they thought it was the Coast Guard and zoomed away. Samson didn't have a radio, so they couldn't find out about the ongoing disaster. The crew got the news about Titanic only when they got to the coast of Iceland the following month. There have been many theories to explain the Titanic tragedy, and one of the recent ones says that there was a fire involved. An Irish journalist went full detective for decades, digging into the mystery, and stumbled upon a game-changer. He came across a photo album that had been hiding from the public for a century after the tragedy. In the pictures, taken at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, just over a week before the liner sailed, you can clearly see a massive 30-foot black spot on the ship's hull. Maloney researched the photos and eyewitness testimony from the time and claimed that a fire spontaneously broke out inside of one of Titanic's enormous coal bunkers. It was raging for a whole 3 weeks and messed with the metal, critically weakening a crucial segment of the ship's hull. Back then, most ships had just one hull, so it was the only skin the Titanic had. That's why the iceberg managed to punch a hole through the ship so easily. If it hadn't been for the fire, the Titanic might have shrugged off that iceberg collision. The company operating the liner knew about the fire, but they decided to conceal that fact. They didn't want any negative stories in the press as they faced some serious competition in transatlantic voyages. The Titanic was sold out, so they stocked up on coal and made it sail. The moon might have also played a role in the sinking. Our satellite heavily affects tides on the Earth. The closer it is to our planet, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of the moon. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide. During new and full moons, the alignment of the moon, the Earth, and the Sun makes their combined gravity reach its peak. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the Sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. It created the perfect conditions for the icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers to move freely. Opponents of this theory say that the difference in tidal force wasn't actually that big, and it couldn't have been the main cause of the sinking. The iceberg tore down the side of the ship, leaving a huge opening in the hull. It wasn't a continuous rip, and damage was caused in several places. Some experts believe the ship would have survived the iceberg if it had hit head-on. The Titanic had watertight compartments designed to prevent flooding in case of a collision. Only the first 3 or 4 of these compartments would have been flooded. This could have helped save a lot of lives. Supporters of this theory put the blame for the disaster on First Officer William Murdoch. Huge, fast-moving ships don't just turn in a matter of seconds like a speeding car. It takes minutes. When Murdoch realized the collision was inevitable, he tried dodging left to avoid a direct hit. But despite his efforts, the ship still collided with the iceberg. You know the rest. Over 1,500 people lost their lives in this part of the ocean, so maybe it's a prudent idea to stay away from it. The spot where RMS Titanic sank remains dangerous. I mean, yeah, there are still huge icebergs out there, but there are even bigger threats lurking beneath the surface. Titanic is sitting about 12,500 feet underwater, nearly 400 miles southeast of Newfoundland. It's been down there for over 100 years, so over time, the wreck's just been falling apart little by little. The infamous ship is rusting just like any iron or steel structure would be underwater. Chemically, when you mix iron, oxygen, and water, that combo sets off a reaction that creates iron oxide, and that's what leads to corrosion. So, steel plates, beams, all that stuff is getting weaker. Parts of the liner are caving in, like the ceiling in the captain's bathroom and a section of the railing that collapsed not too long ago. But in the case of Titanic, a lot of that corrosion is actually being caused by iron-eating bacteria. When the Titanic sank, it split into 2 big pieces, the bow and the stern, which landed nearly 2,000 feet apart on the ocean floor. And now both pieces are covered in this biofilm, a living blanket of bacteria, marine fungi, and all sorts of other microbes. Over time, microbes feeding on the ship's iron have created these things called rusticles, and they are actually speeding up the wreck's decay. Scientists say the stern is breaking down way faster than the bow, mostly because it took more damage when the ship sank. And now, thanks to all that bacterial activity, the stern could be deteriorating as much as 40 years ahead of the bow. So yeah, microbes have been thriving and flourishing down there. If you are a germaphobe, that probably sounds like a total nightmare. But honestly, it's not that bad. For one, they don't even look gross. These rusticles actually look kind of cool, like ice crystals or tiny diamonds clinging to the wreck. And don't worry, you are not in danger. As long as you keep a safe distance from the wreck, no direct contact, and definitely don't go poking around inside, there really is no risk. Speaking of getting dangerously close, we've got to mention the Titan submersible disaster. You know, the one that catastrophically imploded back in 2023 during a trip to the Titanic wreck. Sadly, all 5 people on board lost their lives. Even though this trip was sold as a tourist adventure, going that deep in the ocean is no joke. It's terrifying, cold, and dark. Sunlight gets absorbed by water and can't reach much farther than about 3,300 feet below the surface. Past that point, the ocean is in total darkness all the time. Titanic lies within a region known as the Midnight Zone for this very reason. The few brave people who have visited the wreck say the descent takes over 2 hours through complete darkness. Then, out of nowhere, the ocean floor just pops into view, lit up by the submersible's lights. The second big challenge is actually finding the wreck. At that depth, navigating is no easy task. When you reach the bottom, you really don't know exactly where you are. You're just kind of fumbling around in the dark, knowing that Titanic is somewhere down there, but you can't see it. However, detailed maps of the Titanic site, made from decades of high-res scans, really do help. As the wreck starts to come into view, they can use those maps to stay on track. Plus, sonar and sensors let the crew notice features and objects even if they're way beyond the sub's tiny light pool. For example, the Titan submersible had a sensor called the Doppler velocity log. This one sent out sound waves to measure how fast the sub is moving and how deep it is, based on its distance from the ocean floor. Still, passengers on previous trips to Titanic in this submersible have said how tough it is to find their way once they reach the ocean floor. And we can't forget about the pressure. The deeper you go in the ocean, the more pressure the water puts on everything. And the pressure is crazy high at the Titanic's wreck site. To put it into perspective, it is about 200 times the pressure inside a car tire. That's why submersibles need super thick walls to handle it. So yeah, the water around Titanic has creepy microbes, pitch-black darkness, and insane pressure. But there is one more thing happening down there, and that's unpredictable currents. You're familiar with them. I mean, when you swim in the sea, you can usually feel the currents pulling you from side to side. But the deep ocean has its own set of underwater currents too. They're not as strong as the ones you feel on the surface, but they can still move massive amounts of water around. These currents can be caused by things like wind, differences in water temperature and salt, and even strange storms down on the ocean floor called benthic storms. They can get intense and stir up the sea bottom. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Titanic wreck is in two big pieces, the front and the back, and researchers have been checking out the seabed of the surrounding area. One part of the wreck is near this cold underwater current called the Western Boundary Undercurrent. It flows south and moves mud and sand along the ocean floor, creating ripples and patterns that show how strong or weak the current is. Most of the time, the currents there aren't very strong. They even found sand ripples near where all the Titanic debris landed, like furniture, coal, and just random stuff from the ship. And those ripples are showing a current flowing from east to west. But inside the main wreck site, things get a little wilder. The water flows more from northwest to southwest, probably because all the huge chunks of the ship are messing with the flow. Around the south side of Titanic's bow, the currents get unpredictable too. They keep switching directions, from northeast to northwest to even southwest. It's like the ocean's just doing its own thing down there. Experts think that over time, all this shifting water is going to slowly bury Titanic under layers of mud and sand. Little by little, the wreck could just fade away and disappear beneath the ocean floor. Alright, now it's time to get to the obvious issue here: icebergs. Yep, they're still a problem for ships today. In 2023, around 380 icebergs flowed into the busy shipping routes between North America and Europe. That's a problem. You see, the bigger the iceberg, the easier it is to spot and avoid. Smaller ice is a lot harder to detect, though it's no less dangerous. And that's because the most dangerous part is underwater, where no one can see it. Think about the iceberg that sank Titanic. Passengers saw about 100 feet of it above the water, but it's believed that's only 16% of its total size. Experts say the rest, hidden beneath the waves and much larger than what's visible, could stretch down several hundred feet. Now, the good news is that, unlike Titanic's day, we have much more technology now to spot icebergs in time. Modern ships have radar and satellite imagery that can pick up icy threats hiding in the dark. Some vessels even use sonar and thermal imaging to see through fog, helping the crew to spot icebergs above the surface. GPS and AIS pick safer routes, and monitoring centers around the globe send out real-time alerts, like having a personal iceberg spotting assistant. So, yes, it is a massive upgrade from just relying on binoculars. You won't have to worry about icebergs on your next cruise vacation, even if it passes alongside Titanic's route. But just to be extra safe, try not to travel with anyone named Jack or Rose, and never play the violin while on board. Just saying.
By April 1912, the Titanic was the most expensive and unsinkable ship in the world. These days, the sunken Titanic is associated with some of the most expensive expedition tours in the world. Despite the terrible tragedy, people have built profitable businesses using the famous ship, and these businesses can be very dangerous. The Titanic fell to the bottom of the icy waters of the North Atlantic in 1912. It was more than 70 years before people finally discovered the ship. It happened in the 80s, when researcher Robert Ballard carried out a secret mission to search for sunken submarines. In addition to his mission, Ballard also wanted to search for the wreckage of the Titanic if he had the time. In short, he did find the Titanic. This discovery became the beginning of big profits, fighting for customers, lawsuits, and the destruction of the wreckage. Shortly after the discovery, Ballard came to the U.S. Congress and testified about the Titanic he'd found. He suggested making a sea memorial out of the wreck's site and leaving this place untouched. In 1986, Ballard installed a plaque on the Titanic, and the story ended there. But not for long. The Titanic tragedy was a popular theme, so many companies realized they could make a lot of money out of it. In 1987, an American company, Titanic Ventures, descended to the wreckage together with the French National Institute of Oceanography and got about 1,800 artifacts from there. Then the company received the rights from the US government to rescue the Titanic by parts. Over the course of several years, they made several other expeditions and took more than 2,000 artifacts. The company created a museum where it exhibited the found jewelry, interior elements, personal belongings of passengers, and a lot more. Some artifacts were put up for auction. The company made good profits and inspired many others to do the same. For example, let's take a look at this pocket watch. It belonged to a guy named Edmund Stone, who was a first-class steward. The watch stopped at 2:15 a.m. when it fell into the icy ocean water. After almost 100 years, it was sold for 130,000 euros, which is about $135,000, and is far from the highest price. Another item is the Titanic's ship plan. This is one of the most authentic artifacts from the ship, and it had a practical use. Experts used this blueprint to investigate the wreckage. It helped them understand where the iceberg had struck the Titanic. This plan was sold at auction for $320,000. Do you remember that moment in the movie when the ship began to sink and the violinists started playing their last song? It was actually true. There were real musicians on board who were playing till the end. One of them was Wallace Hartley. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the disaster, but his violin did. Even though it's impossible to play it, it was sold for $1.5 million. In general, as you understand, the hunt for the Titanic's artifacts turned out to be quite profitable. Then, director James Cameron came down to the Titanic. In 1997, he released his famous movie with the same name, and the popularity of the Titanic soared. Collecting the artifacts was no longer so interesting. People wanted to go down to the famous ship on their own. The high demand provided a good supply. In 1998, British company Deep Ocean Expeditions organized tours to the Titanic for only $32,500. From that time until 2012, the company conducted 197 dives to the wreckage of the ship, and during this time, the ticket price doubled. The company, Titanic Ventures, which was the first to get an artifact from the sunken ship, later received the name RMS Titanic Inc., and it sued Deep Ocean Expeditions because it believed that its exclusive rights to salvage the ship's artifacts prevented other companies from conducting underwater tours. RMS Titanic won the court case and banned Deep Ocean from conducting expeditions, but this decision was overturned in 1999. In short, litigation and fights between competitors began. People continued to go down to the seabed to see the legendary ship. There were other companies that organized their own tours. Tourists descended to the Titanic inside underwater bathyscaphs. In 2001, an American couple had a wedding inside an underwater vessel that floated next to the Titanic deck. The profit was growing, customers were coming, and everything was fine, not counting the Titanic itself. The more tourists came down to the ship, the more damaged it got. People wanted not only to see, but also to touch the wreckage. The bathyscaphs could accidentally hit the ship and break apart its parts. The churning of the water caused by boat propellers could also damage the old ship. During one expedition, a bathyscaph crashed into the Titanic, but those who did it kept silent about this incident. In addition, the seabed where the ship lies is littered with garbage. Bottles, chains, weights, nets that people left during rescue operations and tourism. More than 100 years after the tragedy, the Titanic has finally received UNESCO protection. This means that many countries have received the right to prohibit going down to the Titanic, taking artifacts from there and selling them. The saddest thing is that this hype around the Titanic led to another tragedy. In 2023, OceanGate Expeditions conducted a tour on a submarine with 5 people. This was the famous Titan bathyscaph you've probably heard about. So, the Titan began its dive to the Titanic, and after 1 hour and 45 minutes, communication with the bathyscaph was lost. Something broke in the boat, depressurization started, and in a split second, the huge water pressure crushed the Titan. Despite the danger of such a dive, there are many people who want to go on an expedition to the Titanic to see the ship with their own eyes. They're not even deterred by the price of such a tour, which has increased by several times. But for those who don't have several $100,000, oceanographers and divers have created a digital copy of the sunken Titanic. Using a computer, you can visit the ship, walk through its halls, cabins, and deck. The copy has preserved some parts of the ship which don't exist anymore. For example, the famous railings on the ship's bow where Leonardo DiCaprio hugged Kate Winslet have recently collapsed. And you can also visit museums dedicated to the Titanic. There, you'll see various photos, elements of the ship, personal belongings of passengers, and many other artifacts. Anyway, if you have a lot of money and you still want to go down to the Titanic, think twice. And in general, ordinary scuba diving is a rather dangerous thing. These are the problems it can cause. When you dive underwater without preparation and come up too fast, you're likely to encounter decompression sickness, which is also called the bends. Due to the rapid decrease in the pressure that surrounds you, nitrogen bubbles move through the body and might cause paralysis, severe discomfort, spinal cord damage, and many other troubles. Wait a minute, what are nitrogen bubbles doing in your body anyway? Your cylinders contain compressed gas that consists of nitrogen and oxygen. And when you inhale this substance and the pressure around you sharply decreases, nitrogen accumulates in bubbles. According to Henry's law, the solubility of gases in a liquid is directly proportional to the external pressure. The liquid is flowing in your veins and arteries, and the external pressure is tons of seawater around you. Any change in your body pressure can also cause loss of consciousness, and underwater depths are not the best place to faint. Check out on YouTube what happens to people who don't adhere to safety regulations and experience the bends. You'll see that this is a rather unpleasant feeling. What if you get a bad instructor, or you panic and start rising too fast? Or the depth might turn out greater than you expected. Of course, when you're inside a bathyscaph, looking at the Titanic through the window, you feel much more comfortable. But if you're going to scuba dive to big depths, good preparation is vital for you.
How could a ship built by the brightest minds of its time and called unsinkable go down in just 2 hours and 40 minutes? Maybe we can crack the mystery by diving deep into the bolts of the Titanic. And I mean that quite literally. It all started with a fancy dinner in London back in 1907. Lord William James Parry had a big idea and needed the right people on board. He invited the director of the British shipping company, White Star Line, over to chat. White Star was already riding the waves of success with transatlantic travel. making a fortune taking emigrants to America. But the competition was fierce. Cunard, one of their biggest rivals, had just launched two sleek, fast ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. These ships were the latest and greatest in both speed and luxury. Peary wasn't about to let that slide. As chairman of an Irish shipbuilding company, he figured if he teamed up with White Star, they could dominate the scene. That same night, over dinner, they started dreaming up an entire fleet of ocean liners. The Olympic, Titanic, and a third ship that eventually became the Britannic. Soon those ideas were being turned into reality. The construction of the Titanic and its twin, the Olympic, kicked off. It was such an impressive affair that they had to build two new shipyards on Queen's Island, known as Titanic Quarter, in Belfast Harbour. But building something that massive? Way easier said than done. Harland and Wolff, the British company behind the construction, had their hands full. This was the biggest ship anyone had ever tried to build, and it took 15,000 men working round the clock to make the dream happen. The Titanic and its twin were planned to be 882 feet long. It was just enough to stretch another 120 feet longer than the new Cunard liners. By the time it was finished, the Titanic stretched as long as 4 city blocks and high as a 9-story building. Aside from being the largest ship of the time, it also got another nickname. When Shipbuilder magazine went to examine it, they came up with the adjective unsinkable. But something went way too wrong along the way. If we made a quick X-ray of the Titanic, this is what we would find. 2,000 steel plates, each up to 30 feet long and weighing around 3 tons. To put it all together, they built it like a giant metal skeleton, with the keel acting as the backbone and the hull plates forming the outer shell. To beat the competition, the Titanic had to be huge, but it also had to be fast. So to make that happen, they needed to innovate on the ship's propellers. It had 3 propellers, 2 outer ones with 3 blades and 1 central propeller with 4 blades. The outer propellers, which were massive at 23 feet in diameter, were powered by the ship's steam engines. These engines were like the muscle of the ship, converting steam into the power that spun the propellers. The central propeller was a bit smaller, 17 feet across, and it was powered by a low-pressure steam turbine. The combination of engines and turbine was pretty cutting edge at the time and helped the Titanic cruise at about 21 knots. That's roughly 24 miles per hour, which doesn't sound too fast, but for a ship this size, it was impressive. The propellers themselves were made from manganese bronze, a material chosen because it's strong and resists corrosion. Trust me, this is key when you're plowing through salty ocean water. This engine system could produce up to 46,000 horsepower, which would be the equivalent horsepower of 230 cars combined. To make the ship move, there were 2 large propellers on the sides connected to engines that worked like giant pumps, pushing the ship forward. Then, there was a third propeller in the middle, which worked as a steam turbine, a fancy kind of engine, to give it extra push and use less fuel. This whole setup wasn't just about power, it was also about speed. Other ships had started using the steam turbine a few years earlier, but since the Titanic was bigger and heavier, its system had to be extra powerful to keep it fast, stable, and comfortable for everyone on board. So after 2 years of really hard work, the Titanic was ready for its first trial run. On May 31, 1911, a crowd of 100,000 people stopped to watch the Titanic slide into the River Lagan. Lord Peary was joined by American millionaire J.P. Morgan, who had acquired financial control of the White Star Shipping Company. The Titanic floated for the first time, but it took another year to fit it out, which is basically shipbuilding speak for turning that giant steel skeleton into a luxurious floating palace. It had it all: a heated swimming pool, Turkish baths, palm trees in the cafes, a squash court, a first-class dining salon that could fit 554 people. According to some reports, the most luxurious suite aboard the Titanic was booked by an American named Charlotte Drake Cardezza. She paid $2,500 in 1912. Even in today's money, that's a pretty penny for a trip. But if we make a conversion, it's gonna be around $75,000 in the 2020s. All for a one-way ticket across the Atlantic. Workers rushed to finish painting and polishing the Titanic by March 31st, 1912. The 62-year-old White Star captain, Edward John Smith, went on board to oversee the final tests of the world's biggest ocean liner. The captain even said this would be his last Atlantic crossing. Once he got to America, he would retire. On April 10th, the ship was ready for its maiden voyage. It sailed to Southampton to take on coal and its first passengers. Passenger Sylvia Caldwell asked a deckhand if that gigantic ship was really unsinkable, to which he answered the iconic line that not even God himself could sink that ship. 4 days into the voyage, the RMS Titanic met its fate. Even though the ship got warnings about icebergs, it was gliding super fast in the dark. When the lookouts finally saw the iceberg, it was too close for the ship to stop or turn. Imagine trying to suddenly slam the brakes on a huge car. Now imagine that car was 20,000 times heavier than a normal vehicle and moving absurdly fast. When the Titanic tried to steer away, it ended up scraping the iceberg along its side. Even though the crew tried slowing down and turning, the ship sideswiped the iceberg, ripping open 100 meters of the hull, damaging 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. This caused the ship's front to dip underwater while the back lifted up, just like when one side of a lever gets too heavy. At a steep angle, the ship began to break in half from the middle, which is how it eventually sank. But why did the hull and rivets break so easily? A 1991 expedition discovered pieces of the Titanic's hull and found that the steel used was extremely brittle, especially in freezing temperatures like those on the night of the sinking. The steel didn't bend or give under pressure. It shattered like glass, making the impact much worse. Chemical testing also revealed that the steel had high levels of sulfur, which weakened it. This kind of brittle steel, combined with the high speed and freezing temperatures, was a recipe for disaster. Okay, there were material flaws, but the ship's design also had some serious issues. Those watertight compartments weren't fully sealed at the top. So as water flooded in, it spilled over from one compartment to another, speeding up the sinking process. If the ship had been built with better steel, a double hull, or improved watertight compartments, the disaster might have been avoided. Maybe even long enough for the RMS Carpathia to come and rescue everyone on board. The Titanic wasn't unsinkable, but for that time, it was a triumph of engineering and luxury. The thing is, even the best designs can't always beat nature.
There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy, and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going, cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
A beam of electric light pierces the darkness over the calm waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic is quietly making its way through the waves, its passengers asleep, when suddenly a monstrous white shape is caught in the light beam. The fateful iceberg is about to rend the side of the legendary ship. April 14, 1912, only 2 days before someone will take a photo of a giant iceberg with a pretty unusual elliptical shape. It turns out that this iceberg most likely formed out of snow that fell 100,000 years ago. Researchers used computer modeling to figure out its origin. They used data from 1912 and added some new information about winds and ocean currents. They concluded that the iceberg was probably a part of a small cluster of glaciers in southwest Greenland. These days, it's possible to calculate the routes of such icebergs in any given year in the past. So the infamous chunk of ice was on its way from Greenland to an area further south from Cornwall. If the ship had passed through that region only 2 days later, the iceberg would have moved far away from the point where they met. At first, the weight of the most well-known iceberg in the world was 75 million tons. With time, it started to slowly melt away. And when it sank the Titanic, its weight was only 1.5 million tons. By the time of the collision, it had probably been melting for months, but it was still a true monster. When the Titanic sank, the iceberg was 400 feet long, and more than 100 feet of its surface was above the water. Some people believe it was a supermoon that caused the Titanic to sink. That night, there was a rare lunar event. It hadn't happened for 1,400 years. In normal conditions, the iceberg wouldn't have traveled so far south without melting and losing the largest part of its mass. But the supermoon could have been the reason for an unusually high tide that pulled the iceberg away from the glacier way faster than usual. There's a specific type of bacteria that slowly consumes the remains of the Titanic. Salt corrosion, ocean currents, freezing temperatures, plus this rust-eating microorganism might consume the entire wreckage. American actress Dorothy Gibson was aboard the Titanic. She survived, and when she arrived in New York, she started filming a movie called Saved from the Titanic almost right away. The movie was released only a month after the Titanic sank, and in the movie, she even wore the same shoes and clothes she had during the actual disaster. The movie was a big success at that time, but the only known copy was destroyed in a fire. 14 years before the Titanic sank, a novella called Futility had been published, and it seemed to have predicted the whole event. The plot centered around a fictional ship called the Titan that sank during its voyage. The Titan was almost the same size as Titanic, and they both went to the bottom in April. The reason was hitting an iceberg, too. Both the real and fictional ships were described as unsinkable, and both of them had the legally required number of lifeboats, which, as it turned out later, were nowhere near enough. We've seen it in the movie, but there were some real-life love stories happening on the Titanic, too. 13 couples even took a trip on the Titanic as part of their honeymoon. One of the couples owned Macy's department store in New York. Once it became clear the Titanic was rapidly sinking, the woman refused to go into a lifeboat without her husband. But he didn't want to join her while there were still women and children who he thought had to go first. Then his wife gave her coat to her maid. She insisted that the maid should get into the lifeboat, and she wanted her to be warm. As for the woman herself, she decided to stay with her husband till the end. Some people believe Titanic sank because of a mummy, not an iceberg. It all started around 1000 BCE with a mysterious woman who lived in Egypt, in the city of Thebes. People knew little about her, but they called her a priestess. Her mummy was put in a wooden sarcophagus and covered with a large lid with the image of her face and some mystical inscriptions. This place had been hidden until the first half of the 19th century, when a group of locals accidentally came across it. They disturbed her peace. No one knows how, but the mummy disappeared that day without a trace. A couple of decades later, a group of rich friends from England traveled to Egypt and found the empty mummy casket with the image of the priestess, whose dark eyes seemed to be looking into the void. They decided to buy it, but the buyer disappeared the same night before he even got the case. All members of the group had some accidents. The casket changed its location a couple of times until it, as some believe, ended up on the Titanic. It took more than 70 years for a robot submarine to find the ruins of this legendary ship. The wreck lies nearly 13,000 feet under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, split into two halves. Why did the liner break apart? No one knows exactly. Some think it happened because of the water that got inside when the ship collided with the iceberg. The pressure was so powerful it separated two parts of the vessel, starting with the ship's bottom structure. Others say it was because of the hull rivets. They had a high concentration of slag or smelting residue, and that's something that can cause the metal to split apart. The ship generally had many flaws, starting with the design. The watertight bulkheads weren't completely sealed on top. This allowed the water to flow between the compartments and, in the end, sink the vessel. The iron of the ship's rivets and steel of the hull ended up ruined because of high sulfur content, cold temperatures, and high speeds. The steel shattered and the rivets popped out quite easily. Because of this, Titanic sank 24 times faster than it would have otherwise. If the ship had hit the iceberg head-on instead of ramming it with its side, it would have probably stayed afloat. How come the crew members didn't have binoculars? It would have surely helped them spot the iceberg on time and maybe even avoid the disaster. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked in a storage cabinet. Only one crew member had the key, and he had been transferred off the ship right before it set sail. He later said he hadn't remembered to hand over the key. But even without the binoculars, the ship might have had some time to change course and avoid the collision if the crew had gotten some warning. But that's the thing, someone did warn them. About an hour before the incident, a ship that was relatively close to Titanic, the SS Californian, sent a message to inform them it had stopped because of dense ice field. But the warning never got to the Titanic's captain. Some experts say it was because the radio operator didn't think it was that urgent. And later, the SS Californian said they didn't get a call for help from the Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Some say the crew on the Titanic couldn't spot the iceberg on time because of an optical illusion. Atmospheric conditions that night probably caused super refraction, which could have camouflaged the berg. After all, no one actually saw the iceberg until it was too close to the ship to somehow avoid the crash. Not even a whole minute passed between the moment they saw the iceberg and the collision. It was only 37 seconds, and it took Titanic 2 hours and 40 minutes to disappear below the ocean's waves.